everybody. So today we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin and whether or not this is the actual burial cloth of Christ. And so today I'm going to be joined by Teddi Pappas and Dale Glover. Dale has a YouTube channel called Real Seekers, and he has created a lot of content on the topic of the Shroud. Teddi has been a regular guest on the show, and so both of them have a lot more knowledge and even expertise, I would say, on the topic of the Shroud than I do. And so I thought for this first video, it'd be fun to have them on and let them kind of share an overview of the Shroud, and as well as some of the main evidence that supports its authenticity. Hello, Teddi and Dale. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have to say, this is a topic that I've been anxiously wanting to cover, and just honestly, just anxiously wanting somebody to talk about this with, because, you know, this is the Shroud is something that about a year ago I found myself kind of diving into the topic a little bit more, and I found that to the common person, the immediate response is sort of a dismissal or a very, you know, extreme skepticism. But Dale, I must say that I very much appreciate your YouTube channel, and I'll give you guys both a minute here to introduce yourselves, but just to say here up front that I feel a bit like I know both you, Dale, and Teddi, because I've spent so many hours listening to your conversations and all the content on your channel. So I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate all your guys' work that you've been doing, and it has been very valuable to me. And then just to point people also listening to the Real Seekers channel, that I'll of course link to in the video description below. But yes, thank you both for being here today. And Dale, you could go ahead and start out, kind of introduce yourself, and then maybe you could pass it over to Teddi to introduce herself and kind of what your experience is, I suppose, your background with the Shroud.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it is an amazing pleasure to be on your show because likewise, I'm a fan of yours, and I know that we've been on a few shows on the Faith Unaltered podcast together and that sort of thing. And you know, you're a man after my own heart. You kind of expose the falsity of Calvinism and stuff, which I think is really needed because Calvinism is a false doctrine. So I appreciate your efforts in having me on the show to talk about my passion, which is the Shroud of Turin. So who I am. So my name is Dale. I'm the host of a podcast called Real Seekers. And on Real Seekers, I basically, I'm not just Shroud. I focus on the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics. And I cover, I have guests covering a wide variety of topics from the historicity of the resurrection to the existence of God, debates on abortion, that sort of thing. But I am well known for, as Jordan mentions, my Shroud Wars series, which is, I've put a lot of focus into that over the last year and a half or so, really going into depth on the evidences, bringing on the experts on both the pro-Shroud side and the Shroud skeptical side to debate all the evidences related to the Shroud of Turin. And my interest kind of first started with the Shroud. A lot of pro-Shroud people, it's the same way with Gary Habermas, who, introduced me to the Shroud. Before that, I thought it was just dismissed it as a Catholic relic, and hey, I'm a Protestant, that's not for me. But once I saw Gary Habermas taking it seriously, I kind of, okay, I'm going to actually look into this, and started working with him and looking at the evidence, him and Barry Schwartz. And I was just amazed to see the scientific evidence. And yeah, I was like, wow, this kind of like your reaction, Jordan. This is incredible. How the heck does no one know about this? So yeah, that started me on the journey looking into it. And on May 5th, 2018, I finally finished my assessment for Christianity, and I came to faith in Christ in large part due to the Shroud of Turin evidence. So yeah.
Cool. Teddi?
Well, and I'm Theodora Pappas, go by Teddi for short, less of a mouthful. And I'm a criminal defense attorney since 1994. And I have been interested in the Shroud of Turin ever since I first learned about it, just from television. It was right around Easter time. And then the next day at the grocery store on a magazine cover, when I was with my mom, and I was asking my mom if we could go get a book on the Shroud, because I was just so fascinated looking at the holy face. I mean, how does one not get mesmerized by that? And at the prospect that one is looking at the face of Jesus Christ. And so I read my first book. It was by Dr. Gary Habermas. Also, Dale and I have that in common, that connection with Dr. Habermas, and also Dr. Kenneth Stevenson, who is a STURP member. And so their book was called Verdict on the Shroud. One can still purchase that used through eBay. It's out of publication, but it's a great book. But the thing that is so amazing, just like y'all mentioned, is how so many people are unaware of the Shroud, and it appears frequently on magazine covers. I think there was just a show on History's Mysteries that was on right before Easter with Barry Schwartz, the STURP, one of the STURP photographers that was part of the STURP team, and some other important Shroud scholars. And so, I mean, it is out there, but I think with churches not really mentioning it and Sunday schools not mentioning it, I think it somehow passes by the wayside, or people don't give it the attention that it deserves. But a lot of people have never even heard of it, even, which surprisingly, even a lot of Catholics, which that's always the funniest thing to me. I was like, how can you not know about the Shroud? You'd think that, in Catholic schools, and I've had friends who went to Catholic private schools, and they were never told about the Shroud. So it's
just if I to interrupt, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to piggyback. I find it amazing that the Roman Catholic Church has yet to officially endorse the Shroud's authenticity, but yet a bunch of Ahmadiyya Muslims have. So, like, that's something that's just interesting.
If a skeptic is open-minded, I'm telling you, and I'm a criminal defense attorney. I deal in proof beyond a reasonable doubt with things matters at trial, and there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the Shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Christ. And I know that's a big claim, that's a big statement, but I'm comfortable, very comfortable, and happy to make it because I've got the goods behind it that show it. And so I just think that the evidence is so powerful that if a skeptic is open-minded, it has the ability to bring people to Christ who were not with him, but it also has the ability to, okay, so let's say you have, the run-of-the-mill Christian, or even a very strong Christian. Okay, without the Shroud, what you have is there are lots of logical arguments that Christianity is true, such as intelligent design, all sorts of things. But there's still a good amount of faith that has to come into play. I mean, before I learned about the Shroud, I was a Christian. I've always been a Christian. And I would say that perhaps my faith in my confidence level was, 85% or more as a 15-year-old. But I don't think that any Christian, if you're a critical thinker, I don't think you can go beyond about that level of certainty. But the beautiful thing about the Shroud, which is a gift from God, it's a miracle of God's, it's to give us, to those who are honest in looking at the evidence, it will give you proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the Christian God is real. And what is more beautiful than that?
Dale, I saw you unmuted. I wanted to see if you wanted to jump in there.
Oh, no, because I wanted Teddi to finish her intro and stuff, but I was just going to say, Jordan, obviously it's your show. I'm not the host here, but yeah, it might be helpful. Look, for people who've never heard of the Shroud, what is the Shroud?
Yes. Like you just said, Dale, for people who aren't even familiar with the Shroud, hopefully after watching this video, they can, I guess a couple things. One thing is what we've already discussed a little bit, just sort of the immediate either ignorance, and I don't say that pejoratively, but a lot of people just aren't aware of the Shroud, what it is, or that there's any evidence at all, like real substantial evidence that supports it being authentic. Up to a year ago, I didn't give it the time of day because I just thought it's just a waste of time. This is just a weird conspiratorial thing that has no substance to it, no evidence. And like you, Dale, also something I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on here in a few minutes is just one of the thoughts that I had and that I've actually encountered people in my own life when I've tried to discuss it is the whole, oh, well, that's just a Catholic relic thing, where there's something about the Shroud's current, and I'll say current relationship, because the Shroud has not always been in the possession of the Catholic Church. But I think a lot of people, I think especially a lot of, Protestant people, they see the Shroud's current connection to the Catholic Church, and there's something about that they immediately assume that the Catholic Church must have some sort of weird motivations or some kind of hidden agenda. They just are kind of just this distrust, I think, of the Catholic Church that leads them to then have no desire to give the Shroud the time of day. But I think, I hope that in this first video, people can first know, like, what is the Shroud even? Because I want to leave open the possibility that some people will come to this video that might be fairly familiar, but may not really know what the Shroud is. And so could you guys explain what is the Shroud? And I guess, obviously you've kind of alluded to it already, but what is it, and why is this such an object of focus for so many people?
Yeah, so basically what the Shroud of Turin is, in a nutshell, it's a long linen cloth that about 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide or something like that. I don't have the precise measurements, but it's approximately that size. And it contains on it the frontal and dorsal side images of a naked man that appears to have been scourged and crucified. Consistent with the wounds of Jesus. He's got wounds from a crown of thorns, as well as the chest wound that's consistent with what Jesus went through in the Gospel of John when the centurion stabbed him through the heart there. So it looks like that we have a bunch of frontal and dorsal images of what looks to be the crucified Jesus of the Gospels, a bunch of blood stains and blood flows on the cloth. So the pro-Shroud position is basically, well, this is the actual burial cloth that covered the historical Jesus. Whereas Shroud skeptics, on the other hand, want to say, no, you fool, this is clearly a medieval artwork. It's depicting Jesus, but it's just some kind of medieval artwork. This has nothing to do with the real historical Jesus. And I like what you said about the last thing I'll say here before we go to Teddy's take on this question. This understanding that I had, misunderstanding of this association with the Catholic Church specifically, and I want to say that that's not true. Like I said before, the Catholic Church has yet to officially recognize the Shroud of Turin at all, right? They have not pronounced it authentic officially. And the Catholic Church hasn't owned the Shroud even if you take the Shroud from its medieval history, 1350s onward, the Pope has just owned the Shroud since 1983. Before that, it was owned by the King of Italy, King Umberto, and stuff. So there is nothing about the Shroud images that specifically associates it with the Catholic Church. And there's nothing about the history of the Shroud until 1983 that officially associates it with the Catholic Church at all. So I see this as a mere Christianity type evidence in my books.
So the Shroud has a long history prior to the Catholic Church having any sort of possession of it.
Absolutely, yeah. We can trace it back. We have some evidence, as we'll speak about later on, that dates to the 1st century. There are various bits and pieces of evidence where we can prove it predates the medieval period by centuries. And obviously, when we get to that, we'll discuss some of those evidences there. But I believe the shroud covered the historical Jesus, so it dates back to 30 A.D. And I think there's good evidence for that.
I was just going to say I would argue 33 AD instead of 30, but I guess people debate on it.
Yeah, right. So the shroud, it's a linen cloth, has blood stains on it, has this very strange, really unexplainable image that appears on the cloth. So in terms of the biblical references to the shroud, because we've explained now what the shroud is, but I think for a lot of people, especially Protestant people who have a high regard for Scripture, they're going to think, well, what does the Bible have to say about this? Is this just something that people are some relic that people have found? Why would we even think that there was a burial cloth that would be like this that wrapped the body of Jesus? For instance, I know that some people will say, well, there's a reference in John to how the face cloth was wrapped separately and folded separately when after the resurrection. And so I guess my question is, are there biblical references to the shroud that would, if we're taking the gospel accounts as being truthful, that we could look at those and say, okay, well, we know that there was something like the shroud. And so whether this is it or not, we know that there was a shroud that did exist. So what would some of those biblical references be that kind of establish the fact that there was indeed this cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus?
Well, you just mentioned the best one, which is in John, when you're looking at as they're going to the empty tomb and what they saw, and John specifies to seeing more than one cloth. And many will say that that we still have this sudarium, the sweat cloth, the cloth that went over Christ's face when he was brought down from the cross. It's called the sudarium of Oviedo, and there's a lot of evidence to support that there is a correlation between it and the bloodstains on the shroud. Now, it's not perfect. And as I've scrutinized it and I've heard skeptics' arguments, first of all, I haven't done what I consider to be a deep dive into the sudarium. So, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I personally think that it is legit what's in Oviedo, but it's not something that I would lead with when dealing with a skeptic. But I think that there's good evidence to think that it's credible, but it's not evidence that is at the level that we have for the shroud. I mean, it's just no comparison. On the shroud, we have an image that is, I believe, not made by human hands, and I believe that the evidence points to that it was miraculously created.
So what you're saying is that there's actually two cloths, two artifacts or relics, separate ones. One is the shroud, obviously, which would be the larger cloth that would have been the cloth that wrapped his body. And then there's a separate cloth called the sudarium that would have been the face cloth. And so kind of two different subjects, two different artifacts, at least, that are worth their own kind of research into, but there is some evidence that there's a correlation between the two.
Yeah, because I actually did study the Sudarium. I had Caesar Barta, who has actually written an entire book on the Sudarium. So I think the evidence, this is one of the stronger bits of evidence for the pro-shroud side. So perhaps I have a slight disagreement with Teddy, but
Yeah.
I think that basically the Sudarium is talking about what in John 20 is that head cloth, as Teddy mentioned. But for various forensic experts have studied the blood stains and the body fluids, as well as the anatomical proportions of the nose based on these fluids and that sort of thing. And they have found and concluded that these two cloths had to have covered the same corpse. And I think that that's some pretty compelling evidence there on a balance of probabilities. You know, Caesar Barta has done experiments. It's not like you can just cover a random corpse with blood flows and get the same patterns and that sort of thing. But you originally asked what would be a positive example of a Bible verse that speaks to the shroud. So I think the best is Galatians 3:1 that says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your very eyes that Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." And this is, you know, my friend Larry Stolley, he mentions several Bible texts that he think are cryptic references to the shroud. I'm a little bit skeptical of those myself, but Galatians 3:1 is by far the best case that I've seen. So that's the one where I'm kind of, there's something here, definitely.
Yeah. You know, I think we haven't gotten to even the most fun parts of this whole discussion yet, which would be diving into some of the, Teddy, as you've referenced, some of like the core, most powerful evidences that really, in many ways, would just leave, you know, an alternative kind of hypothesis to what the shroud is or how the image got there as unreasonable, just because of the overwhelming weight of the evidence. But I think before we get into that, I just had one more thing I wanted to cover here, which is the and we can do this briefly, but just the carbon dating that took place, I think, in 1988. Where they carbon dated the shroud, and obviously there was the whole thing that came out where many then went to assume that the shroud was confirmed to be a medieval forgery or artwork of some kind. And so I guess just to kind of, again, clear that out of the way for those who might be watching this video, wanting to hear out the evidence, but might have that kind of in the back of their mind that, oh, well, hasn't the shroud already kind of been confirmed as being not authentic due to the carbon dating?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to get that out of the way, because that is definitely something, if anybody knows anything, if you do a quick Google search on the shroud, probably the first thing a person is going to see is, oh, it's been debunked through the radiocarbon dating in 1988. Oh, it's just a hoax. Yeah, baloney. So we have shroud scholars that believe that the radiocarbon dating results are accurate. And we have shroud scholars that think that they're not. So honestly, it's a win-win either way. We can argue it in the alternative legitimately, because scholars like Bob Rucker, he's a retired nuclear engineer. He has been doing a lot of work and regarding image formation, and he thinks that the radiocarbon dating is accurate. Now, let's be clear. There's a difference between saying the results in one tiny area are accurate versus saying what they have extrapolated from that information. That means that the shroud is a medieval piece of cloth. Those two don't follow, because
sorry, just to clarify, what you're saying is you have shroud experts that are pro-shroud, In other words, experts, that scholars that believe that the shroud is the authentic burial cloth, and both sides. And you might have some that believe this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, that think the radiocarbon dating was flawed, it had issues, and it can't be relied upon. But then you have those that think, oh no, the carbon dating was accurate. It was an accurate result that we got from it. But what you're saying is that even if the carbon dating result in 1988, if it was accurate, it doesn't necessarily reflect the age of the shroud, due to different factors that that have to do with what sections of the shroud were analyzed.
No, the best way to, I can't do justice to Bob Rucker's explanation, but just to kind of give somebody an idea, what he talks about is that if you, and he's got a whole line of argument to support this. It deals with neutrons and how different areas of the cloth would test differently if you radiocarbon dated it, and that's connected to a resurrection event. So he's saying that the readings that the three labs got in that one area, because it was a small area. Originally, STURP wanted and proposed that they test various areas from the shroud. And initially that was going to happen, but then some of the C-14 people got in and persuaded the people in charge of the shroud, the church officials and stuff, to not do that. And so that's why they only took it from the area. And of course, it didn't take much to persuade the church to, oh, you don't need to do that, because they don't want to cut into this relic. I mean, it does kind of mar its appearance to have a rectangle taken out from the side. But I mean, there was already from prior custodians of the shroud, like outside of Catholic Church, where they were snipping away little pieces of the shroud to give as wedding gifts to royalty and things like that. So, I mean, arguably, you're just kind of taking a little bit more. But anyway, but Bob Rucker's hypothesis, and he's got a lot of information that supports it. If you Google his name, Robert Rucker, it should, in Shroud of Turin, it should, his work should pop up. He's got lots of things explaining it in detail. But again, so there are some people, you can believe in the radiocarbon dating results is true, and that still does not mean that the shroud is of medieval origin. It doesn't necessarily follow that because here's what happens. What is present in a small portion of the shroud isn't necessarily indicative that the whole shroud is like that. Let's say if I have a napkin or a tablecloth and somebody spills some coffee on it. If you test the area with the coffee, you're going to see, well, there's coffee on here, so does that mean the whole tablecloth has coffee on it? No, it doesn't. It means that where that spot was. With radiocarbon dating, in terms of the people that find it to be questionable, there's the invisible reweave theory, which I think there's a lot of reason to think that there was we actually know that the shroud has been mended. They were always holding it up from the edges, and that's where they took the radiocarbon dating sample, from the edges. So honestly, it stands to reason that that particular area was mended. And we do know that they had done some mending on the shroud, where there's documented history of that. Joe Marino and his late wife, Sue Benford, they were the ones that came up with the invisible reweave hypothesis. But even aside from that, there's a very easy and simple way to neutralize the big bomb blast of the radiocarbon dating results. And that is there's a company called Beta Analytics. They are the largest radiocarbon dating company in the world. They're in Florida. People can look up on their website, go to Beta-Analytics. You will see that when they're referring to the radiocarbon dating of textiles, that they have a little caveat there saying that it needs to be done as part of a multidisciplinary process. Now, why is that? Why? Because typically radiocarbon dating is done on things that have not been created and altered by man, such as bones, rocks, things like that. The shroud is flax fiber from a flax plant that has been manufactured and created and had all sorts of things done which alter its carbon content, things like that. So that's why they say with textile evidence, it needs to be part of a multidisciplinary approach. And that is because, as archaeologists frequently see, and we have a very famous archaeologist, Bill Meacham. He's a shroud scholar, and he was involved back then in a lot of the planning and discussions for the radiocarbon dating in Turin. And when he saw that they were only going to take a spot from one spot, he was objecting very loudly to that, as were the other STURP members. But nobody listened to them. And now you got this, situation where, but anyway, so the whole point is that archaeologists sometimes will come across something that they radiocarbon date, and they realize, they see all of the other artifacts and things that are around it, and they know this is from a certain time period. And so sometimes there are outliers. People think that radiocarbon dating, when I was in college, it was called the gold standard in my physical anthropology class. And it is the gold standard, but it's not perfect. First of all, people don't realize radiocarbon dating makes assumptions that carbon decays at a steady rate forever. And that's actually not true. So there are, a lot of times people say, well, science shouldn't be based on assumptions. Well, radiocarbon dating uses assumptions. A lot of times it's right, but sometimes there have been results where things have gotten a date from radiocarbon dating where it dates into the future. Well, obviously that can't be right. Or certain things that they know are modern that have a bizarre date. So again, people need to look at the body of evidence and see that there's a mountain of chemical evidence and other forms of evidence from different types of scientific evidence plus history. And when you have that mountain of evidence and then you just have the little radiocarbon date that's off, and again, maybe it's not off, maybe Bob Rucker's right, but it neutralizes it. So it's a big nothing burger, is my position on it. And I believe that wholeheartedly.
Dale, what are your thoughts on the radiocarbon dating?
Yeah, so when it comes to the carbon dating, I see it, there are two questions that need to be answered. So the first question is, are we justified or epistemically warranted in believing the shroud is medieval on the basis of the 1988 carbon dating results? The second is, we've got these results. So how do we explain that? So on the first question, I argue that we're not justified in believing the shroud is actually medieval, despite the carbon dating giving medieval results, because there are certain problems. So for example, they only dated one shroud sample location. And even Harry Gubb, who was the co-inventor of the AMS carbon-14 dating method they used, admitted that one sample location is just not a sufficient number of sample locations to have confidence in the results. There's always going to be doubt and scrutiny in the scientific community on that front. The second reason we lack epistemic justification is there has been empirical evidence suggesting that the sample location is non-representative to the rest of the cloth. And that's some of the stuff Teddy was mentioning there, and Joe Marino comes up with, and stuff like that. And then the third one is the most important one. That's where Bob Rucker's statistical calculations come in, and it proves, look, it's not enough to explain just the raw dates, the 1260 to 1390 AD dates. We also got other data, such as, for example, the distribution or range of the dates and the slope or the gradient of the dates. So when they dated this sample, they broke it up into 12 subsamples, right? And each of those subsamples gave a different radiocarbon age or date. And you can calculate statistically the slope of those dates. And what we get is a slope of 36 years per centimeter. So starting from the edge of the cloth, moving towards the center of the cloth, the age gets younger and younger, 36 years for every centimeter you go in. Now, this is impossible to happen. This can't be ascribed to random measurement error. This is statistically significant. And Bob Rucker has mathematically calculated and proven there is a 98.6% probability that some kind of systematic bias is at play. So something is affecting these results. And I don't know, I can, I'll show a pic. I won't share my screen, but I can show a picture of what Bob's model predicts in terms of the slope of the dates. But you have to explain that slope. You can't just ignore that. So that's where we come to, okay, great. Well, we've got these results that do date the Shroud of the medieval times. So how do we explain that on the pro-Shroud side? And there have been about 5 types of explanations. So the first one that came out was, not surprisingly, conspiracy theories, literally. We had someone like Stephen Jones saying, oh, well, the Russians hacked the computers and gave us that. Nobody on the pro-Shroud side today takes those kind of conspiracy theories seriously. But that was one type of thing to try to explain these erroneous results. Secondly, there was ordinary contamination. So for example, smoke contamination or fire, the various things, ordinary contaminants can affect the carbon dating results. And that's what Teddi is alluding to when she quotes Beta Labs and their concern, or the fact that, living snails carbon date to the future and stuff like that. Well, it's because of ordinary contamination that
and they do specify. I forgot to mention they do specify on Beta Analytics website that if you're bringing in a sample, don't smoke near it. And that water can contaminate it. Of course, the Shroud has water stains that are very clearly visible on it. And the Shroud has been in 2 fires. So that's a little bit more than smoking. So contamination's a big deal. But sorry for interrupting, Dale.
Yep. Ordinary contamination, definitely. Now, I will say this, that the ordinary contamination explanation in and of itself is insufficient. There's no way to get a cloth from 30 AD, not 33 AD, up to the 1350s or the 1320s, whenever you want to date it to in the 14th century there. Ordinary contamination alone can't get the trick done. So this is why people have appealed to either extraordinary forms of contamination or the invisible reweave hypothesis. So the invisible reweave is another technique where it says material from the 1500s was sewn in through a technique called French invisible reweaving. And basically when they carbon dated it, they had 20% material from 30 AD and 80% of the material would have to have been from the 1500s. That averages out to give you this medieval date in the 1300s. So that's the invisible reweave explanation. Then there are 2 forms of extraordinary contamination, and I'll finish after this, give it back to you, Jordan. But the first one was proposed by John Jackson. This was carbon monoxide, extraordinary form of contamination that could take a 1st century cloth and add enough carbon-14 content to give us those medieval results. Now, this was actually tested in 2008 by the Oxford labs, the Radiocarbon labs, Dr. Christopher Ramsey, and it has been scientifically falsified. So we know this isn't the explanation, but it was an option that was actually experimentally tested, empirically tested. Finally, we have Bob Rucker's, this is the one I go for, neutron absorption. And this is where, during the resurrection event, it's posited that neutrons from Jesus' body, a small fraction of them, affected the carbon-14 content, raising the amount, and this pushed the 30 AD cloth to give us the results that he specified. Now, am I able to share my screen, Jordan, just for a quick second? Or
yes.
Yeah. This is Bob Rucker. Bob Rucker is a nuclear engineer. He worked for the government, and he used what's called the MCNP, Monte Carlo Neutron Particle Software, which is used by the government. So this isn't just, some random conspiracy guy. He's using the most sophisticated software in the entire world in terms of neutrons. And he's calculated, so the way the sample they dated was around here in the medieval period. This is where they the carbon dated the shroud in 1988. And guess what? Everything matches according to Bob's thing. Not only just the raw dates, but the slope is 36 years per centimeter here. It's also consistent with the distribution of the dates. But you can also see he goes beyond that and says, look, if we did carbon date different sample locations, for example, if we carbon dated the middle of the shroud man's stomach here or chest, we would actually get a carbon date of 8,500 AD in the future because the neutrons affected the carbon-14 dates. And this hypothesis is empirically equivalent. It explains all of the same data as the medieval hypothesis, but I would even argue it's superior because that slope is really suggestive that there's some kind of systematic bias going on. What is that? I would argue it was neutron contamination. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. But back to you, Jordan. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah. Well, I think if nothing else, what hopefully people can see is that they shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the shroud entirely based on that 1988 carbon dating, that there's perhaps a little bit more to the story than, the headlines that the shroud was debunked and whatnot, that you might see on a magazine at the grocery store. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into some of the evidence. And obviously there's no possible way to discuss all of the evidence surrounding the shroud in one video. But hopefully what we can do is look at Teddy again, as you referenced earlier, some of the more powerful evidence. And I have a handful of questions that I want to ask that can maybe help us kind of focus that. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit here briefly, a point that really kind of still, I think, stands out to me as one of the most interesting aspects of the shroud is that moment in 1898 when the first photograph was taken of the shroud. So can you maybe talk about that a little bit, and why was that such a profound, I guess, moment when the first photograph was taken and kind of what was discovered in that?
Well, it was stunning. 1898. A lawyer, Secundo Pia. He was also a city councilman and also an amateur photographer. And he got permission. There was going to be an ostension, an exhibition of the shroud. And he got permission from King Umberto I to be the first person to ever photograph the shroud. And of course, that was, 1898, an old-timey, old-style camera. So when he went back home to develop it in the darkroom, and he has those big, plates, he goes and he's in the darkroom, he's developing, got the plates, putting on the chemicals and stuff like that. And then with what he sees with the photograph of the face, on the shroud. He was so stunned he almost dropped the photographic plate. But what he saw when you initially look at the shroud, just the cloth itself and the image on it, the face looks almost cartoonish. It's, you don't really see eyes. You just see these little things like almost like goggles or on over the eyes. You see a sort of this body image, but it looks kind of strange and I don't know. What he saw is, and again, a lot of younger people are not familiar with the old style of, using film and a camera and having to
Right.
get film developed, and where you then get these little strips called negatives to where the dark is light and the light is dark. And so back then there were negatives. And when he saw the reverse, where the dark portions were light and the light portions were dark, what he saw stunned him. He saw this highly detailed face and images that you don't see when you just see the cloth. And like I said, he reported that he almost dropped it. And the interesting thing is when he then was showing people publicly the photographic negative and how there's all this amazing detail to where you can really see, you get a very good idea of what the person's face looked like that made the image on the shroud. And he was he had a cloud over him where people were thinking he was a fraud, that he was trying to pull a hoax on people. And that followed him for many, many years until I think it was maybe 1931 when Henri took photos of the shroud, and his negatives proved that Secondo Pia's photos were legitimate. And so, so he got to be vindicated during his lifetime, which I'm sure he was glad to see, and got to tell everybody, "I told you so."
Right.
But yeah, so that was a really stunning moment in history.
Yeah, I think just so Teddy steals all the great stuff by speaking first, right? But I think one thing you miss, Teddy, is
Ladies first.
ladies first. Okay, but there is something significant you miss. So haha. But there's this major impact. Look, the world's scientists up until this point, up until 1898, when Secondo Pia took that photo of the shroud and discovered the photographic negativity aspect of the shroud's images, that was earth-shattering for the scientific community at the time. And this was totally shocking. It was just assumed this is just some medieval artwork, like Bishop Darcy said back in the 1380s and stuff, that there was no conception that this thing might be real. And so when they discovered this sent shockwaves around the world. And this actually led to, in 1900 and 1902, the first ever, at the French Academy of Sciences, they had a medical exposition because they could now see the images clearly in this photonegativity. And, even a non-religious agnostic like Dr. Yves Delage admitting this covered a corpse. My gosh, this is proof. As a medical expert, and they presented this to the French Academy of Sciences saying there's no way this is artwork. This covered a human body. So that's something, another incredible thing that sparked off the subsequent scientific studies. But it all started with that photo, because before that, it was just assumed. There's nothing to talk about. The shroud is a painting. Who cares about it?
There is a very tight provenance of the Shroud of Turin, the one that's in Turin, that we can trace that back to around, 1350s or so, in Leary, France. almost nobody disputes that. Even a lot of the hardened skeptics don't dispute that. But of course, that works for them because they say it's a medieval relic. So that's how they get that. But there's a lot of evidence to believe that the Shroud of Turin is one and the same with this thing called the image of Edessa. Now, the image of Edessa, if you can show that the image of Edessa and the Shroud of Turin are one and the same, then you can radiocarbon date that thing all you want, and you can say whatever you want about it, but it's just ridiculous if those two things are the same, because the image of Edessa, first of all, when this cloth came to Constantinople, which at that point in time, in 944 AD, Constantinople was the hub of the Holy Roman Empire, okay, of the Roman Empire. So it had shifted from Rome to Constantinople. So now we've got the Byzantine emperors that are in control of things in Constantinople. There is tight evidence. There are documents. This writing. It's a book called the Narratio, basically like the narration, where it was Emperor Constantine before he became an emperor, writing this about the image of Edessa that came to Constantinople in 944 AD with huge fanfare like nobody's ever seen. Because if you're bringing in the cloth that wrapped Jesus Christ with his blood on it and his supernaturally imposed image, where people had been talking way before that this was an image that was not made by human hands. When you're bringing in such a cloth into your city, I think you're going to have a lot of fanfare. People have a lot of fanfare for lots of silly holidays, big deal, somebody's birthday. Can you imagine what was going on? And he chronicles this in the Narratio about when this came in. There's some Shroud scholars that say, no, it was at another time that what's in Turin, the Shroud of Turin, came into Constantinople. And I say, baloney, you show me in Byzantine history when there was a bunch of fanfare surrounding that, whenever you're claiming it came in. No.
I'll just jump in just for the audience sake,
right,
because they have no clue what you're going on about, right? But in terms of the history of the Shroud prior to the medieval period, so Teddi is talking about where was the Shroud between 30 AD all the way up to 1204 AD in Constantinople. And just for the audience, there are two major different theories. So Teddi takes the mainstream one in pro-Shroud scholarship, which is the image of Edessa theory. So what was the Shroud? It was this cloth we have known as the image of Edessa. And she's pointing to certain historical texts that speak of this, specifically the story of the image of Edessa, which is written in the mid-10th century. And then there's the alternative, which is the view I take and Jack Marquardt take. It's a minority position, but it says, no, the Shroud wasn't the image of Edessa. It's this cloth known as the image of God incarnate. And we provide an alternative history. So just for the audience, just be aware there are two historical hypotheses as to where the Shroud was in the pre-medieval period.
Say whether or not there's the icon of Beirut, there's the image of God incarnate, the image of Edessa, the Shroud of Turin. A rose by any other name smells just as sweet. And I think that it doesn't matter what we call it. And I'm not sure that these might all be the same thing. All I know is the proof is in the pudding.
So I guess, Dale, for like the audience who might not be familiar with a lot of the discussion surrounding the Shroud, concerning, for example, what's being discussed here, like the image of Odessa or the different icons that have, records of them in history. I guess why is this, just to kind of clarify for those listening, why is this an important aspect in kind of possibly at least pointing to the authenticity of the Shroud, concerning, I guess, the dating of the Shroud or the age of the Shroud? Like, how does this all correlate with a discussion about the evidence of the Shroud's authenticity?
Yeah, so I think, as Teddy mentioned before, right, like the earliest uncontroversial date that the vast majority of pro-Shroud and even Shroud skeptics will admit, that we know that the Shroud was definitely around in the mid-1350s. So between 1355, 1356 is when it's undisputed. The Shroud was being exhibited in Liry, France by Geoffrey I de Charny. And everyone's kind of unanimous on that point, minus one or two, like Clive Prince or something who thinks it was made by Leonardo da Vinci, but these are conspiracy theorists.
He wasn't even born back then.
Well, they date the Shroud to the 15th century, but they're kind of conspiracy nuts, I would say, right? Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett are known for that. But why is this important? Why would we care about, the Shroud, is the image of God incarnate hypothesis true, or the image of Odessa hypothesis true? Is because we're trying to establish through the historical documents that we can prove, no, the Shroud did pre-exist the 1350s. We can show it was in the Byzantine Empire, so on and so forth. There are other historical documents dating back even further. One of the better ones that Jack Markwort points to is the Hymn of the Pearl, dating in the 2nd century AD, that he alleges speaks of, in allegorical language, a robe, which is allegorical for the Shroud, that Jesus is looking at, and he sees his double image reflected. Double image, isn't that talking about the Shroud of Turin, which has the frontal and dorsal images? So that's the importance of these, appealing to these historical documents and trying to say, well, we can prove that the Shroud of Turin was around in these earlier centuries, going all the way back to possibly the New Testament, if you believe some of those New Testament texts and stuff. So that's what pro-Shroud proponents are trying to establish there.
Okay, that makes sense. And so going back to kind of the moment when Secondo Pia took the first photograph, and Dale, you mentioned how that kind of set ablaze, in a sense, the scientific, I guess, focus on the Shroud. Like how, and I'll try to remember when I'm going back and editing this conversation to put, Teddy, as you're talking about that moment with what you see, if you actually look at the Shroud today, what you're going to see is a very, kind of obscure. You're going to be able to tell that this is a person. But once you get that photo negative of that image, it's like a positive image. You can see the details of the face and so much more there, which was just something that I think people, to grasp how truly crazy that is. And I think one of the things that continues to point to is that, who would have thought of that? I mean, this material, this shroud, this linen that had existed long before photography was even invented, and people even knew what photo negatives were. How is it that one would have known how to correctly implant this image onto this cloth so that, centuries later, when something like photography was invented, and the picture was taken of it, they knew that these details would suddenly come out. I mean, the idea that that image was somehow, produced onto there artificially, it just becomes a lot less probable when you consider that. Is that kind of part of why you guys would say that the initial photograph was kind of a significant moment? Is that it kind of pointed to, in a sense, on its own, the authenticity, and then sparked the following research that happened.
Absolutely, yeah. It was incredible, right? Because it was just assumed it was a painting before then. So yes, of the scientists, they assumed it was a fake. But once they saw this photo negative, right? So the negative images were actually what would have been the photo positive. This was revolutionary because obviously in the medieval period they did not have photography or that kind of technology. It was unheard of at that time. So there would have been no way for medieval artist to create, let alone anticipate, photograph technology and purposefully create negative images just to create that feature. That would have been historically impossible and scientifically impossible because they wouldn't have had the technology to do so at the time. So I think that was kind of where it was revolutionary to them. There's no way an artist could have purposefully done this. So where we are after that is where the current scientific state is. Okay, could it have been a happy accident, a byproduct of some medieval artistic process? And that's where we get into further scientific studies like STURP in 1978, which rule out those further options.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's go ahead and move on to STURP, because that kind of this whole photographing and discovering this image on the shroud kind of led to the subsequent research that people wanted to know what caused this image. Why is this thing the way it is? And so maybe explain what was the STURP team? I know, Teddi, you kind of mentioned briefly already, but what was the STURP team, and kind of what was their purpose in going in for these 5 days and studying the shroud? And then what was it that they ultimately kind of discovered and kind of came away concluding after their research?
The STURP team, these were a bunch of hot shots. These were not just kook people that were, part of this team. Many of them were from Los Alamos National Laboratory, where, they're the people that make a lot of the military, like bombs, nuclear weapons for the U.S. government. Sandia Laboratory, a sister lab with the government that does the same sort of thing. People from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. There were professors from the Air Force Academy. Lots of people with PhDs. I mean, lots of. There was also later on that joined in a chemistry professor that specialized in porphyrins, which are in blood. Lots of specialists. Later on, the STURP team was joined by Dr. Robert Buckland. People more my age might be familiar with the television show Quincy, that was about a chief medical examiner in LA. And Dr. Robert Buckland was the inspiration for the Quincy character. And he was also listed in the credits of the Quincy MD show as, giving them technical advice and stuff like that. So, he was chief medical examiner in LA County. So you can imagine in Los Angeles, all of, the bodies that he's examined, as well as chief medical examiner in Las Vegas. So lots of experience with looking at forensics and dead bodies and figuring out blood stains and what they were caused by and how people died. But anyway, so in Turin, they had 5 full days around the clock, and they were using all of that time. And they were some of the biggest things that were done, at least from my perspective. I think they had this thing called an X-ray fluorescence analysis. It's a machine, and they were able to actually scan the whole shroud to look at it. That's how we know that it's not a painting with iron oxide, is the microscopist Walter Macrone claimed that it was. because they went into Turin, all these guys, thinking it had to be a painting. So all of their tests and stuff were really surrounding the issue of, okay, is it painting? Because we think it's a painting. What else is it going to be? So, so they did lots of tests in order to test out, and lots of paint, especially in terms of the color. You have to think, well, what kind of paint would have made that? It would be paint with iron oxide. Iron is a metal. X-ray fluorescence would detect metals. When they also did X-ray radiography, like, you get an X-ray from a doctor's office, it picks up metal. So if the image that we see was made of iron, well, when they did this X-ray fluorescence scan, there's what they found is that the background of the cloth had a rather uniform layer of iron, calcium, and strontium. Now, one of those things are iron. And there are actually 3 forms of iron on the shroud. When you look at the big, grand poobah of skeptics, Walter McCrone, the late Walter McCrone, he was saying the shroud's a medieval painting. He said there is no blood on that shroud. He went to his grave saying that. And he was, he was a big to-do. He was good friends with Ray Rogers, who was one of the big chemists that was part of the STURP team. And they had been friends for many, many years. And McCrone, he was the one that got first crack at looking at these sticky tapes under the microscope. What are the sticky tapes? Ray Rogers, the chemist, during the 1978 STURP analysis, the chemist Ray Rogers had this special tape made, basically like Scotch tape, made by the 3M Corporation that makes Scotch tape. But they made it so that it wouldn't leave residue on the shroud, any sticky residue. So what they did was, imagine like a lint roller. You get, the lint roller with its sticky tape. You put it on something, and when you peel it off, you got all these fibers and substances on the tape. Well, each one of these tapes, probably about this big, had over 1,000 fibers, microfibers, particles on it. And there were 36 that he collected. Now, Rogers held on to 4, and he gave the other 32. I can't believe he gave all 32 to McCrone to look at, because he was going to have another STURP member, Dr. John Heller, who was a very sophisticated scientist and knew a lot about blood and just science in general and chemistry. He was going to do the microchemical analysis. And then Dr. John Heller ended up associating, and who then became part of the STURP team, Dr. Alan Adler, a professor that was at a university in Connecticut. And he was a specialist in things that dealt with blood, such as porphyrins. That was his favorite topic. And porphyrins are the substance that makes blood red. Some people think it's the iron in blood. It's not the iron in blood. It's porphyrins. It's like a pigment. But anyway, so before Ray Rogers was going to give the tapes for microchemical analysis to Heller, and then Heller and Adler, the dynamic duo, he agreed to let Walter McCrone have first crack at looking at them. Since he was a world-famous microscopist, he had written a book a few years before called The Particle Atlas. People referred to him as the father of modern microscopy. And his Particle Atlas had all these pictures of particles and identifying them. So to help people looking at a microscope, like, hey, if you see something that looks like this is what it looks like under the microscope. So he had examined masterpieces to determine whether they were frauds or not. So he was a big deal. So when he then announced that there is no blood on the shroud, and that confirmed what a few years before the Italian Commission said, which they started in 1969, and they did some testing in 1973 to see if the blood stains were blood or the blood images were blood. Their results were inconclusive. So, gee whiz, you've got the Italian Commission. They can't confirm blood. Mr. Fancy Microscopist Walter McCrone is saying there is no blood. And he did some forensic tests for blood. And he says there's no blood on there. It's iron oxide. So that looks like, holy mackerel, it's a fake. He said, this expert who's looked at Da Vinci's and other masterpieces and had seen medieval icons and other paintings, even with cinnabar. He said, no, those blood images, that's cinnabar, which is the mineral that creates the red pigment that makes vermilion paint. Now, I'm an amateur artist, and I have some vermilion. I did an experiment where I put a little bit of vermilion paint on some linen, and I dropped a little bit of blood from my finger on it. It's almost identical. It's hard to pick them apart. And of course, vermilion was well known to be like the perfect color. If you're going to paint blood, that's the color. So anyway, it's looking really bad for this shroud, because it's not like the people in the Italian Commission were a bunch of flunkies. There were a bunch of people that were specialists in forensics, fancy scientists, professors. They had great bona fides as well, but not as good as Heller and Adler. Heller and Adler recognized, and of course, even the Italian Commission, they said, they didn't say it wasn't blood. They said our results are inconclusive. And that's because those forensic tests, the typical forensic tests that are done for blood, don't always work so great with old, ancient blood that has become denatured through sunlight, through heat. Again, the shroud has been in 2 fires. So, but people will say, McCrone says in his book, oh, but there are mummies that have been found that are much older than the shroud, and we've been able to confirm blood on those. And you know what Teddi Pappas says to that? She says, well, you know what? When you get a mummy, when these archaeologists on these fancy digs get a mummy, what do they do with it? They then put it in a protected environment, in a lab, in a museum, in cases. But that's not what happened with the shroud. For years, it had been, even in the medieval times, people were carting this thing around, displaying it out of doors. John Heller says this has the dust of ages on it from what he saw on the sticky tapes. This was not a protected cloth. This had been out in the elements. It had been in a fire, water stains. So it's a horse of a different color, and you can't compare the two. But so Heller and Adler did tests. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And they figured, okay, this blood, the reason why the Italian Commission, their tests and Walter McCrone's tests didn't work is because they were not able to get the particles into the solution to get the test to work. And they were like, well, that's a sign that the blood is denatured. So they did other types of tests that enabled them to find out and to confirm that it was indeed blood. How do we know that? Because, for example, hemoglobin was found. Hemoglobin is not in iron oxide or vermilion. Serum albumin was found. When they put the they took photographs, special photographs that did ultraviolet light with it. And they were so surprised, the STURP team, to see that around almost all of the blood stains, no, without ultraviolet light, around the big blood stains, you could see, even without ultraviolet light, some serum halos around the blood stain. For example, you get a cut, you put a Band-Aid on it, you take the Band-Aid off, you'll see the brownish red part in the middle, and then on the outside, you'll see this kind of yellowish stuff. The yellowish stuff around the blood stain, that's the serum halo. Well, same thing on a cloth, if it has been in contact with a blood clot. And painted blood will not leave a serum halo like that. But so they see all of these serum halos. So then Heller and Adler, they go and test these serum halos, and they confirm that it is serum albumin in it. Well, first of all, around all the scourge marks where Jesus was beaten, we see all these wounds of scourge marks on the shroud, over 100 of them. Those did not show to the naked eye serum halos. That was only seen with the UV light. So how is a forger going to, and why would a forger add those details? Now, there are some that say, oh, maybe they put lemon juice, which is a known anticoagulant, in the blood, because to paint all those things, you've got to have fresh blood. Well, blood coagulates very, very quickly. So what, is some forger going to have this constant supply of fresh blood to be painting his little blood stains on? But again, it's not painted blood. These are blood clots. And painted or dripped on blood has a different look. When you drip blood onto linen, there's this thing called capillary flow, where the blood will start to go across the weave of the linen. So a drop of blood on linen is kind of going to look like a star where it starts traveling. Like if you get a paper towel and you put it into some colored water and you just drop it in there, part of it in it, that water is going to start to flow up through capillarity through that paper towel. So if it were liquid blood, you'd have a different look. But with a blood clot that is clotted and then transferred, there's a little bit of that capillary flow in the blood stains, but not nearly as much as what you would see as if it were dripped on or dried. And so, they were just seeing through so many different ways, that there's serum albumin, there's protein on it. The serum halos fluoresce. Many of the serum halos, again, through the scourge marks, you couldn't even see them without the UV photography to reveal it. So that's, one of those little tidbits that a medieval forger, even a modern day forger, wouldn't have thought to have added details like that. But, so there were just so many different aspects. The blood is blood, but Adler, the biggest thing is he found porphyrins in the red stuff. And porphyrins, while those can exist in plants, the porphyrin in a plant, you don't have to do anything to make it fluoresce. porphyrins in blood, you have to add certain chemicals to it, which he did, and then he brought out the fluorescence. But so they confirmed. Also, another thing with the blood stains that confirm that that's added evidence that they're legit is a blood clot. As blood dries, so let's say you cut your skin and the blood dries on your skin. What's going to happen is the central part of the clot, the blood is going to start to move outward towards the edges, towards the perimeter of the clot, which leaves the central part a much thinner layer of blood, and it causes the outer parts to get a raised edge. They were seeing that on the shroud, the thinner parts in the middle, the raised parts on the edge. So it was rather stunning. Now I've been talking a long time. Dale's got to want his time. I can get back. I just think some other things, but you go on too, Dale. Don't want to hog up all the time.
Thanks. Awesome. Yeah, and fair enough. I know this is your area of expertise where you have legitimately, in terms of Macron and the blood, you've gone beyond even the STURP scientists and found some new discoveries and that sort of thing. So I'm glad that you got your fair say, and I think you covered a lot. I guess the only things, so you didn't mention one thing in terms of the paint. Is that the question we're on? Is it paint or blood? So obviously the pro.
Yeah. Yeah, I think emphasizing how what the STURP team ultimately concluded about the image formation and whether it was something that was an artwork, a painting, or if what they discovered was that the shroud actually came into contact with a corpse and the stains were a result of actual human blood.
Yeah, so on this front, so it's important to note. So in terms of the question of paint or blood or on the body images, there was a total absence of paint found. So we have the two sides. The STURP scientists discovered that the body images are probably created from dehydrated or oxidized cellulose, right? Like when your newspaper turns yellow in the sun, that's dehydrated cellulose that's causing that yellowing, straw yellow color. On terms of the bloodstains, as Teddy has gone in great detail, they have proved conclusively that it's blood. And I think Teddy has really given a lot on that front. I'll just add two things that I didn't hear her mention. But in terms of the spectral tests, I think Al Adler in his 1986 video says it best, right? Because look, for each of the spectral tests and even the chemical tests and stuff like that Teddy was going on about, maybe a desperate shroud skeptic might come up with some excuse that explains, why did we get this result proving it's blood and not paint for this test, or for another excuse for this test and that sort of thing. But in the end, when you have over a dozen spectral instruments all giving the same result, and you have to come up with ad hoc excuses to try and explain away that data, not to mention all the chemical tests, microchemical tests that Teddy was going on about. Look, if you tried to posit 15 to 20 different types of paint into the peer-reviewed literature, it would be bounced instantly. There's a thing called Occam's razor, right? And the criterion of simplicity. With just one substance, blood, we can explain all of the data. It is far superior, far simpler explanation than trying to say, well, maybe he used this type of paint and, X, Y, or Z happened to that, and that explains why it failed this test and blah, blah, blah. No, it's blood. And this is why even shroud skeptics like Hugh Ferry admit the obvious. This is blood, proven beyond all reasonable doubt. There is blood on that shroud. Same deal with the body images, that we know that there is no paint found on those body images. Now, Macron, he tries to say, but I made certain discoveries. I found iron on the shroud, right? So he thinks that the body images are composed of red ochre or an iron oxide pigment. Well, the funny thing is, STURP scientists were aware of this, and they proved that there is iron on the shroud, but it's not due to a paint. That iron is relatively uniform in body image areas and non-image areas on the cloth. So actually that's better explained by the retting process. So there are alternative explanations that make more sense in terms of that data. Another thing is Macron, he claimed he found proteins and that sort of thing. Now, that's indicative of a binder, or, that you put the pigments in and that sort of thing. Now, there is a conclusive test here that I actually wanted to mention. It's the proteasis test. And this, according to Al Adler, it does provide near absolute proof that there were no proteinaceous substances or paint binders, as Walter Macron suggested, found on the body images of the shroud. And this proteasis test, in terms of the blood stains as well, they revealed there were no body images underneath the blood stains, which is part of the reason why they think that the blood stains were coated on the shroud first, and then the body images were encoded on after the blood stains. So the blood stains, whatever process created the body images, the blood stains interfered and stopped that process from taking place. Those were the things I wanted to contribute in a nutshell. If you forget everything, that proteasis test is absolute proof. Macron is wrong. There is no paint on those body images.
And I think just to point out for those, again, who might be new to this, that's another kind of intriguing element to me that I've continually found just very interesting. Just the fact that you mentioned there, Dale, that the blood, it was determined that the blood was on the linen prior to the image. And so I guess maybe if either one of you want to jump in and explain the significance of that, and I guess why that would kind of, again, perhaps at least fall in line with the hypothesis that the image was formed by an event like the resurrection.
Okay. So Teddy, you're gonna have a long answer on this. So I'm gonna go first very quickly, and then I'm gonna let you say your things. I know you've got a lot to say.
I'm not known for brevity.
Got to work on the concise, but yeah. All right, cool. So as I said, it's been scientifically discovered that there are no body images underneath the blood stains, and this is part of the reason in terms of image formation. The majority, it is still controversial. There are some pro-shroud scientists who have questioned this, but the vast majority do say that the best explanation for the data is that the bloodstains were put on the shroud first, and that interfered with whatever mechanism created the body images on the shroud. So on that front, this is telling for what types of mechanisms might apply, right? So for example, if you used a scorch mechanism, an artistic scorch back in the medieval period, well, if you scorched the body images on first and then painted the blood, you would still have the body images underneath it. Or if you put the blood images on first and then you scorched it to create the body images, that those blood stains would be scorched to tech. They'd be turned to black and they would be damaged themselves. They would have thermal degradation, I guess is the technical terminology there. So as you can see, this is a relevant factor for what types of image forming mechanisms might be responsible for creating the images. And I think this is a way to rule out all of the artistic mechanisms that have been proposed as possible mechanisms. So it's relevant in that way, in that really this fact is only compatible with hypotheses that suppose there is an actual body and the bloodstains were transferred to the cloth in one way or another from the body to the cloth, and then at some point something happened to the body itself to create those images. Now, I go for Bob Brucker's vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis, but I think that some kind of radiation was used to create those body images, and that's what degraded the cellulose and that sort of thing, or oxidized the cellulose to create the body images. And it can also explain the bloodstains as well, because the bloodstains would have either been transferred to the cloth naturally through direct contact first, or, as Bob would say, through that pulse, that radiation burst. That actually was so forceful, it pushed the bloodstains onto the cloth first. And then the proton radiation went out to create the body images, but it didn't create body images where the bloodstains had already been deposited on the cloth. So I think that, does that answer your question in terms of the relevance of that fact?
Yeah. Yes, I believe it does. And so the blood stains, or at least the apparent blood on the cloth, it has been pretty well established that it is human blood, that this cloth did in fact come into contact with a human body. Is that, would you say that that is a fair assessment to say what was established by the STURP team?
Before Teddi answers, because so she's shaking her head, and rightly so. I know it's in her head, but also wrongly so, right? So I think, like Kelly Kears, it is a conclusion that it is probably human blood. But it's important to note we can't prove that it's human blood through the chemistry, through the chemical studies and spectral studies and stuff like that. There was Teddi will get into the details on that front. I don't think we can prove it that way, but based on forensic factors, it's obvious that it would be human blood, because we can prove forensically that, well, this is how blood would flow on a human body. And as Gilbert Lavoie says, what's the quote, Teddi, where he's like, this is exactly how blood would flow and congeal on human skin if he had been scourged and crucified, as the Gospels teach about Jesus. So I think forensically we can prove it's human blood. But on terms of the STURP test, we're not there yet.
Okay.
We just know it's blood.
So maybe, Teddi, then can you explain how you think we can establish that it is human blood, whether that's through forensics or elsewhere?
Sure. And I, if you don't mind, I'd like to explain a little bit, because there's some bad information that's floating around, and it started, I think, sometimes what happens just in any area, somebody says something wrong, and then people keep citing to that information, and then it just goes all over the place, and you've just got bad information. The STURP team, with their blood testings and analyses, they never ever said that it was human blood. Okay, they said that it was primate blood. Now, back in around 1980, the situation with the current state of affairs of testing and stuff like that, they did all the tests that they needed to do based on what the knowledge was there. They tested different other species to see if there would be an immune response. I think dog, cat, baboon, several different things, several different animals. And so it all pointed to, yes, this is primate blood, but of course that could be, a gorilla or things like that too, not just human. Now, fast forward, science has become, new things come up, and it's been found out that there are more animals that can have what's called cross reactivity with human blood. So now they're not so sure that it's primate blood. We can't say that definitively. No, if they did current blood tests on it, they could with new tests. But based on what was done around 1980, we can't say with what was tested. Now, again, like Dale said, forensically, we can use our common sense and figure out, you've got a body image on here that nobody can explain or reproduce. how it got on there, other than, what I think it is. I think it was, I don't know what kind of energy it is. My very strong suspicion is that it's not natural energy. Why would God choose natural energy for the radiation, for the resurrection? I think it's some sort of God, supernatural energy that would befit something like resurrecting Jesus Christ. So I think all these people that have these ideas about different energy, they might get close, but I don't think they're ever going to hit the nail on the head, because I don't think it's something of this world that created that energy. And if you think about it, if a body is dead, all the energy has left the body. To resurrect a body, you need energy. So there's got to be an infusion of energy. And, so I think that, to me, that seems kind of obvious. I'm sure other people will disagree, but when you put everything together, that's what you get. But so when you have this inexplicable image on the cloth, and of course there are lots of identifiers, we can get into that later, that it's Jesus, and you think of the resurrection event, well, and you see the wounds that correspond with the Gospels, with where Jesus was pierced. There's only one person in all of history that we know about that was crucified with a crown of thorns, and that was Jesus. And so, given how the bloodstains are, it's rather obvious that it's a crucifixion victim. We also know that crucifixion victims frequently had pre-crucifixion scourgings. Now, another thing, I guess I'm getting into identity. Another thing that helps identify this body as Christ is we know from the Gospels that Christ received a much heavier scourging than what was typical. That's why Pilate was so surprised that he died so quickly, because crucifixion was meant to be a long, protracted death. Initially, Pilate gave him that heavy-duty scourging, again, more so than normal, because a really bad scourging can kill you. So again, if you're going to crucify somebody, you don't want them to die really quick. But initially, Pilate was giving them the heavy scourging, hoping that that would appease the Jews and that they would agree to not crucify him, because, of course, Pilate did not believe Jesus to be guilty of what he was accused of. And so he felt sorry for him, and he was trying to save him. But the scourging, we see over 100 or so scourge marks. That's pointing to a very heavy scourging that's in line with what Jesus received, not what the typical scourging was, just enough to wear down the person, so that when it came time to positioning them onto the cross and nailing them, they're not going to have too much fight left in them, because they're worn out from the beating they just got, the scourging. So we have that is, I think, pointing a lot to identity. The crown of thorns, which actually, when you look at the bloodstains, they go up high enough on the head to where it's not the thin circlet like what is frequently seen as in art, but it's more consistent with probably what would have been almost like a cap of thorns. So, you've got those aspects, but in terms of, back to the issue of why do we think that these came from a human body, when you see a supernaturally created image, and then you see bloodstains and they correspond with the Gospels, well, these are all some pretty big hints that the blood came from the body, and the body was Christ. Now, I'd like to delve a little bit more into the question that you brought up about the blood stains, and is it blood first, image second, which is the mantra, that the STURP team would mention. They used these chemicals that would eat up protein, because of course blood has protein in it. So they wanted to see whether underneath the blood stains, if there was going to be the straw yellow colored body image or not. So the way to do that is to use a chemical to eat up, if it's blood, to eat up the proteins to then see what's underneath. So they did that. And what was underneath was not straw yellow body image. It was the same color as the background image of the cloth that has neither blood nor body image. Now let's get again also into the body image and why this isn't a painting. The first thing, and Dr. Alan Adler always liked to emphasize this, if you're going to say something is a painting, there's a rule in science. It's called necessary and sufficient. What's necessary is, if you're going to say something is a painting, it's necessary that you find paint on the object. But that's not enough. Now, let's dive into, because, the Shroud's always full of tangents, but I need to go on a tangent here. Now, I'm going to nitpick a little bit with what Dale said. There is paint on the Shroud. There's vermilion paint. Shocker. Wow. Macron said that the blood images were painted with a watercolor made with a gelatin binder, and it was done with vermilion paint. And Macron found vermilion on the Shroud. Heller and Adler found vermilion on the Shroud. Giulio Fanti found vermilion on the Shroud. Another Shroud scholar, Gerard Lecote, found vermilion on the Shroud. So is Walter Macron right? Not by a long shot. Because again, necessary and sufficient. Vermilion is made from mercuric sulfide. Mercury has an opacity that's almost the same as lead. When they did the X-ray fluorescence testing of the whole Shroud in Turin, if those blood stains, and some of those are very big, if those blood stains were made from mercuric sulfide, they would have lit up like fireflies. The X-ray fluorescence and the X-ray radiography would have picked up on that very easily, yet it didn't.
Teddi,
because they're not made of vermilion.
Teddi, can I just say one sentence just to support you?
Sure.
Back you up? Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No worries.
But yeah, in terms of this necessary and sufficient condition. So yeah, okay, fine, Teddi, I take your point about the nitpick. There were pigment contamination found on the Shroud, but that's not all. There was wax, there was tallow, there's pink nylon. A modern felt tip pen mark was found on the Shroud. Bugs' legs. The point here is that these were proven. We know that these are just external contamination. They weren't sufficient to say. Do you believe that the Shroud is made up of bugs' legs? I don't think so, right?
But paint, given that it was accused of being a painting, given that it looks like a painting, given that the STURP team even thought it was a painting before diving in.
I was trying to back you up.
I know, but we're still going to come out on top. Don't worry. I'm just presenting the full story.
Fair enough.
Because if I don't present the full story, if I just present the highlights and the good stuff, then, the skeptics are going to raise these issues, and then people aren't going to know how to respond to them. So it's important that we nitpick this to death to know what's the other side going to say, and here's how we respond, and we're going to win. So anyway, so with necessary and sufficient, so we do have some paint on the shroud. And, old Walter McCrone said it was iron oxide in the form of red ochre paint. Well, first of all, red ochre paint isn't even the color of straw yellow. The big tip-off is the word red in red ochre. It's a reddish color. The shroud body image is a straw yellow color, and actually it would be yellow ochre that would be a close match if you're going to get a paint. But yellow ochre is different chemically from red ochre. So that aside, but again, necessary and sufficient. The X-ray fluorescence, the X-ray radiography, if the body image were iron oxide, if the blood images were vermilion, that would have popped up on the X-ray fluorescence. Now, okay, the icing on the cake is that the X-ray fluorescence was sensitive enough to pick up on invisible iron on the shroud that's uniformly coating the entire cloth. Well, when I say uniform, I mean, I can't say 100% in every little spot, but I mean, let's just, in the conventional meaning of the word uniform. And the reason why there is iron throughout this cloth uniformly, so if we see iron, calcium, and strontium from the retting process, which is the manufacturing process to turn flax plants into linen, which can then be spun into thread, which can then be made into cloth. And when the flax plant is in water, usually a natural body of water, the retting process, it stems from the word like rotting. It's to cause the fibers of the flax plant to come apart from the pectins and the kind of the gluey substances in the fiber. So it comes apart. But while the flax plant is in this natural body of water, it tends to pick up certain chemicals that covalently bond onto the flax. And those three things that are known to do that, even in modern linen, if it's done the traditional way in terms of being water retted, even modern linen, as Helen Adler tested, will have iron, calcium, and strontium uniformly found on it. So the X-ray fluorescence was sensitive enough to pick up on invisible iron throughout the cloth. So if it can pick up that which is not visible, logically, it would pick up iron that is visible if iron was forming the body image. But of course, iron is not forming the body image. Now, with the vermilion, again, that would have shown. So then the question is, how in the world did vermilion get on the shroud? That's going to kind of bug people. Well, don't worry. We got an answer for that, which is legit. There are over 50 painted copies of the shroud, which have been documented. What would happen is the Catholics believe that if you have a relic, a holy relic, like some part of a saint or like their bones or something that they touched, if you touch something to a first-class relic, the object that you touch to the relic now becomes a third-class relic. Okay? So what some churches were doing is they were having replicas painted of the shroud. So an artist would come in and look at the actual shroud and paint it. And usually their copies were really, really bad. Put that aside. And what they would do is they would then take the painted copy, touch it, and press it down to the genuine shroud and kind of rub it a little bit so as to kind of take its special essence, the fact that it touched Jesus Christ. Now this other fake shroud, the painted one that has touched the real thing, has something obviously very special about it from having been in contact with it. Yet the Frenchman Locard, who's like the father of forensics, the Locard principle of contact transfer says that any time, this is applicable in modern day forensics, any time two things make contact with each other, each one transfers something of the other onto the other thing. Now, there was paint. Undoubtedly, they were using probably iron oxide paint and vermilion. But we know for sure there is a Professor Giulio Fonti, he did a study and he found that a painted copy of the shroud that had been in contact with the genuine one, that it had iron oxide paint for the body image, and you guessed it, for the bloodstains, vermilion paint. So I'm sure that there are probably others of the painted copies that have those on it too, but we know for sure, at least this one in Sicily, the Palma de, I think, Monte Chiaro or something like that. So if nothing else, and vermilion too is notorious for not adhering well onto canvas and for flaking off. Now, when you've got paint on a canvas and it's moving around, it's not on a stable, frame holding it up, it's easy too for paint to flake off, just because the dried paint is crunching and can flake off. So there you go. There's how little tiny unimportant pieces of vermilion, why they are there. But again, they don't make up the image. Now, the other thing is too, when we look at the yellow, the straw yellow body image color, there's no shading on it. There's no brush strokes. There's no directionality. When you're painting, there's a direction to how you're moving the brush, or if you're doing a powder rubbing or something, there's a direction that shows on things. And they don't see any of that on the shroud. And the color, there's certain parts of the shroud that will look darker than other portions. And people say, oh, well, it must have gone on, the image or whatever it is it's created, the image is heavier in that area, like shading. No, it's not. Actually, the yellow color forming the body image is within 2%. It's all the same color within about 2 percentage points. In the areas that it looks darker, it's just like with pixels, like computer pixels or inkjet. If you put a bunch of pixels or dots close together, it's going to look darker. If you put the same number of dots yet spread it apart, the color is going to look paler. So that's another thing that points to it not being a painting. But for it to be a painting, there has to be an explanation for what kind of paint, pigment, stain, or dye could create this body image. And, as Dale said, it's dehydrated, oxidized cellulose, just like when a book, an old book turns yellow. And another thing in terms of blood first, image second, when they removed the blood from the bloodstain areas, they noticed not only was the color underneath the bloodstain the same as the background, they noticed that the fibers were intact like the background. With the body image, this straw yellow body image, those fibers are brittle because of the dehydration and the oxidation. So there's that additional, difference that is seen. And one other thing that's important with the iron, there are 3 forms of iron on the shroud. There's the iron from the retting process, as I mentioned, which is just uniformly spread throughout the shroud. There's iron from the blood that we have confirmed, we've shown there are numerous ways that they tested and confirmed blood. And of course, blood has iron. There's also iron oxide, though. Oh, that same thing that's the pesky pigment, the red ochre, iron oxide. Oh, why is there iron oxide on the shroud? Again, guess what? Again, we mentioned the shroud has been in 2 fires. Well, a lot of these kooky looking things that are on both sides of the shroud, those are burn and scorch marks from the fire of 1532 in Chambéry, France. Now, some of those burn marks cross over into blood, like in the chest wound. And guess what burnt blood turns into? Iron oxide. As my dad would say, how about them apples? So it's no wonder that there are pieces of iron oxide, because when they were folding the shroud as well as rolling it, at one point, after the fire of 1532, when they did the repairs to the shroud, putting the patches on it, they were putting it on a long rod and rolling it up. That rolling process, think of linen and the texture of linen. And if you roll linen onto itself, that's like sandpaper scraping up against those blood stains. So you're getting blood stains, you're getting body image that's being scraped through the rolling process, which then causes it to move around or translocate to different parts of the shroud. And John Jackson did an experiment and found exactly that happens, that it moves around. So burnt blood, as well as just regular blood, as well as even dried body image fibers, are all over the shroud. Things aren't just tightly, where they are. So
I'll just confirm on that iron oxide thing, just out of interest. That's where David Falk, using that D-stretch program, he found presence, according to him, of iron oxide. The pink highlights. I don't know if yeah, maybe, okay. Well, he used an archaeological program called D-stretch, which detects iron oxide pigment, and he said, oh, the shroud is covered in it. Interestingly enough, it was around the scorch marks and the burnt blood stains only. So even Hugh Ferry was like, this proves the opposite of what you're saying. This proves the STURP claim type thing.
Oh, David Falk, that was that guy from about a year ago.
The Egyptologist.
Right. Oh, gosh, that.
So I was just his study.
When you said it, it was like, I didn't remember. When you said D-stretch, I was like, that rings a bell. Oh, yeah, that David Falk guy.
Yeah, but his study supported exactly the STURP claim that the iron oxide was coming from these scorch marks and the burnt blood.
Another interesting thing about the vermilion is that, and I started putting this together as I was putting together a timeline with Macron. Macron only, okay, so again, Macron's this big, fancy, internationally recognized microscopist who's who's seen medieval vermilion, and he's the big kahuna.
It's important. So he only tested one sample for the blood when he found vermilion, 3 CB. So on the basis of one sample, he made this big conclusion. But
the even bigger thing is that Macron had 32 tapes for over a year. Now, imagine if you're a big microscopist like him. He had his lab back in those days when he was doing all of this. His lab was like one of the first places to have scanning electron microscopes. It was cutting edge. I remember Googling to see, he said that his lab had over $1 million worth of equipment. Back in those days, I found something online to give me a current amount for, adjusted for inflation. That's like $10 million worth of equipment that he had back then. Yet for over a year, because he loved the polarized light microscope, and he felt it was just near and dear to him, which is kind of sweet in a way. And he felt like, oh, these fancy microscopes, they're getting all the attention, and everybody, people just think of the polarized light microscope as a child's toy, which, when you can go to a toy store and get a very simple, low-end.
It was the dinosaur of microscopes.
Yeah. And it was like, now it's a child. People think of it as just a child's toy. But, of course, he obviously had higher-end microscopes than what you get for under $100 at a toy store. But he wanted to solve the mystery of the shroud with the polarized light microscope, because that's what he just loved. And so he for over a year, he used, and he writes in his 4 papers, it's mentioned and in his book that he used nothing but the polarized light microscope. And it was only after the STURP, they had to pry those tapes out of him. He did not want to let them go. And so they got him. It was only after they got them that he held on to one of the tapes, which says something about him, because, those weren't his tapes to hold on to. And when the owner comes to get them back, and he was also good friends with the owner, and he then pockets one of the tapes, and then they finally realized that, hey, you left out one of it was from the side wound, which is the biggest blood stain. So, he kept, the biggest one for himself, and he then sends it to his fancy lab to do the scanning electron microscope. They are the ones that found the vermilion. So Mr. Hotshot Macron, the big microscopist, the father of modern day microscopy, he had these tapes for over a year. He was looking at them all the time. He never found vermilion on them. And he, by his own words, tells us how he's familiar with what vermilion is. For goodness sake, he wrote the Particle Atlas book, identifying iron oxide, vermilion, blood, all of that. Yet he never saw it, which goes to point out that it was just an incidental thing that was just from at least one of those paintings that had vermilion. But so, as a lawyer, I'm always aware of how experts can frequently disagree on things, and how also experts can sometimes make huge errors. And one of the reasons, too, why Macron, I think, initially misidentified, never saw blood, and he said, well, I know what blood looks like. Well, the problem is when he was looking at the sticky tapes, these tapes, turns out the material, even though when Ray Rogers ordered it, it was supposed to not be optically active, the tape, to where it would interfere with how the tape looks when you're looking at it through a microscope and how light refracts off of it. When McCrone was taking this thing called the refractive index, because every substance has its own particular refractive index. And blood, it hangs around at about a 1.5, and vermilion and iron oxide around double at around a 3.0. McCrone said all of the stuff he was seeing was around the 3.0 area. So that's another reason why he was saying it was iron oxide and vermilion. Problem was, he didn't do his job right. When he was measuring the refractive index, he was looking through the tape, and it turns out, and he knew that mylar tape, which is what it was made out of, is optically active. When Heller and Adler were looking at the refractive index and analyzing these substances, they were taking the particles off and the microfibers off of the tape and looking at them. So I think what happened is initially at the first STURP conference that happened after Turin, it was in Santa Barbara, McCrone had the tapes for about 3 months, and he was saying that it's all iron oxide. And Heller and Adler weren't thinking that was the case, but at this point they hadn't gotten all those tapes from McCrone. They had managed to get 4 tapes from him, and they were seeing things that looked like blood. But, and they even saw something that looked like blood on a tape that McCrone said had no blood on it. So again, this tells us he was sloppy with his work. Now, was he purposefully? I think he was really just sloppy, because I don't think he would have sent them a tape if he knew it had blood on it, saying it doesn't have blood. So, just a bunch of sloppy. I mean, I could just go on and on, but anyway, it's amazing. And one more thing. The iron oxide that was found on the shroud that we're saying is burnt blood. How do we know that? When you have burnt blood, it's going to be pure, the iron oxide. Iron oxide that comes from the minerals to make red ochre, it's almost always contaminated with either manganese, cobalt, aluminum, or nickel, and those things were not found in the iron oxide, which further shows that this iron oxide was from burnt blood, not from paint. Now, could there be some iron oxide from paint? Maybe, because again, a painted copy of the shroud came into contact with the genuine one. But in terms of what they found and what they tested, it was pure.
So I think you've done a lot to demonstrate that, the fact that you can find, maybe traces of paint. One shouldn't conclude that therefore what we see on the shroud is an artwork of some kind. And there's obviously a lot that you can dive in there to demonstrate that. One thing I wanted to kind of circle back on, and I know, Teddy, you kind of mentioned a few points on this question here, but it would have to do with the identity of this person on the shroud. And I can let you jump in here, Dale, because I think you might have some further thoughts. But, I guess going back even to the mention earlier that the STURP team determined that the blood was primate blood, I can see a lot of people hearing that and just saying, okay, well, why think then that this is, why assume then that it's human blood, or even further than that, why assume, knowing that this is cloth that came into contact with not only a human body, but the body of Jesus Christ. And so I guess with all these things, why still would one conclude that this is blood that came from Jesus as opposed to some other victim of crucifixion. And I guess what would you, I guess, say in that with answering somebody who might have immediate questions and skepticism surrounding the fact that the STURP team was pointing to this being primate blood?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the last question first, we just the scientific data at that time suggested that it would have been primate blood based on the cross-reactivity studies, and I know Teddy explained that in great detail, and I've had Dr. Kelly Kearse, who is a blood expert and immunologist, on my show explaining that as well. So I think we just have to be honest that in the 21st century, science has advanced in this field, and we've learned new things that they didn't know back in 1978 about cross-reactivity. And we just have to admit that we can't prove with the technology today, we can prove that it's blood, but we can't prove that it's human blood specifically, nor can we necessarily even prove that it's primate blood. We just have to say it's an open question at this time. And we have to be honest that that's what the data proves for now. But I don't see that as, oh, well, you haven't proved it's human blood, therefore it's not human blood. That does not follow. That's illogical. It's non sequitur. And as I said, we do have non-chemistry related reasons, such as forensic studies, to base and anatomical reasons for saying this is probably covering a human being, therefore it's human blood. It's, as Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, another medical expert, said, this is clearly blood as it flows and congeals on human skin. It's the blood flow patterns are not consistent with a blood flow on a pig or some other animal, right? So forensically, we can connect it to a human. Now, how do we connect it to the specific human, Jesus, who is God in the flesh? And on that front, Teddy, I like Teddy's answer, but I'm going to quote the famous medical expert, the Bob Buckland. Sorry, I was blanking on his name. Robert Buckland, who is the basis for that show, Quincy medical show there back in the 70s. And he says, quote unquote, after listing all of the unique wounds, all of the scourge wounds, just like Jesus was scourged, the proper depiction of a crucifixion with the nails through the wrist, not through the palms, at the center of the palms of the hands and that sort of thing, and through the feet. And also unique wounds that are unique to Jesus. So the crown of thorns that I mentioned, and that chest wound. So based on these forensic and contextual factors, I'm going to quote Bob Buckland here. Quote unquote, it is the ultimate responsibility of the medical examiner to confirm, by whatever means are available to him, the identity of the deceased, as well as to determine the manner of his death. In the case of the man on the shroud, the forensic pathologist will have information relative to the circumstances of death by crucifixion, which he can support by his anatomical findings. He will, of course, be aware that the individual whose image is depicted on this cloth has undergone puncture injuries to his wrists and feet, puncture injuries to his head, consistent with the crown of thorns, multiple traumatic whip-like injuries to his back, and post-mortem puncture injuries to his chest area, which has released both blood and a water-type fluid. From this data, it is not an unreasonable conclusion for the forensic pathologist to determine that the only one person historically who has undergone this sequence of events is the person of Jesus Christ. And so that's answering totally naturally. And if you bring on top of the fact that we can prove based on what STURP discovered about the various physical and chemical features of these shroud images, that they are probably miraculous on top, I think that's where I would agree fully with Teddy. It's unreasonable. It is proven beyond all reasonable doubt that who else could this be? It is Jesus. It is Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus Christ of Christianity. There is no other candidate.
Another thing with the blood, in terms of how we can know it's human and that it's from the body of a human, because again, with the shroud, this 14-foot cloth, I mean, it's massive. You really don't fully realize. I mean, you think, okay, I know 14 feet's big, but until it's just pulled out in front of you and you see it right in front of you, it's just huge. There, and this crosses into the painting issue. In order to paint that, there was this very famous shroud scholar and very famous painter, Isabel Pixac. She's deceased. She used to paint these ginormous murals in lots of churches. Some of them are like, I think something I heard 75 feet tall. She gets on scaffolds, things like that. She was noticing that when you look at the position of the man on the shroud, well, first of all, he's in the position of rigor mortis, of a person who died on the cross. Now, that's a very interesting thing, because it's like, why is there an image of somebody in rigor mortis on an unexplainable body image? There are lots of people who've been wrapped up in shrouds. Jewish people, Muslim people wrap lots of people of the deceased in shrouds. But usually you're going to have putrefaction on it, right? You know, as the body decomposes. How is a watercolor painting going to hold up to that? How is a watercolor painting, like Macron said it was, when they were hosing down the fire in the fire of 1532, part of the reliquary that held the shroud, it was silver on top of wood. Some of it started melting. That's how we have those burn holes and scorch marks on the shroud. Some of the water stains come from when they were putting out the fire. Some of that water got into the breached area of the reliquary. There's lots of water stain marks in areas where the body image is. If the body image is a dilute watercolor painting, water being thrust onto it, especially in the steamy environment of the reliquary, that's going to either wash away the watercolor, or it will at least skew it. Yet, you know what you see when you look at those water stain marks? People can just get online, take a look at like on Shroud Scope or shroudphotos.com, where you can get in real tight shots of the shroud image. Look at those water stains, like especially in the torso area. What you will see is the edges of the water stain. Oh, also another thing, the edges of the water stain marks also have iron oxide. And we think that they did, Dr. Alan Adler did an experiment, and that's the iron that is uniformly throughout the shroud. When the water hit it, it disrupted the iron content that's just uniformly throughout the shroud from the retting process. And as it dries, it pushes it out to the edges of the water stain margins. And when they tested the central part, they confirmed that the central part of the water stains doesn't really have much of an iron signal like the rest of the shroud does, because it got pushed to the margins of the water stains, which have the higher iron content. And with the oxygen from water and the heat, because it was in a fire, that all created chemical bonding to add iron plus oxygen, which gives you iron oxide. So, but now I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
Well, I think it's interesting you brought up the rigor mortis.
Yeah.
That's something I forgot. That also helps to identify it as Jesus, because we know the body was in a state of rigor mortis at the time. At the time it left the shroud somehow, leaving behind images that are, I think we can argue, are miraculous. So somehow this body miraculously left the shroud without causing damage to the bloodstains or anything like that, and left behind these remarkable images. I think that implies strongly that there is a resurrection. Well, who claimed a resurrection? Jesus Christ. So that's something I forgot to mention in terms of identity.
So you're saying that there's no like indications on the blood patterns of something you would expect, like smearing or smudging of some kind. If, for instance, the body was moved off of the shroud, it's almost as if it just somehow disappeared and the shroud, collapsed on itself, leaving the blood stains intact.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not like someone unwrapped it to take out the corpse like a grave robber. There would be smearing, at least some smearing or damage or alteration to at least some of the blood stains. Sure, some of them would have been dried, so okay, maybe they wouldn't have been damaged, but not all of the blood stains would be in the same state. There would be some, because when they were transferred to the cloth, they were in that moist jelly-like substance that would have had to be. There definitely would have been some alteration to some of those blood stains if somebody unwrapped the body and stole the corpse and left the shroud behind.
And how long does it take for rigor mortis to let up, typically?
So, Teddi, I am just going to say this. So, Teddi, I'm going to let you go. She has done amazing research. She's, in fact, quoted a 150-year study on rigor mortis. But this is an objection that skeptics will give, and they'll say, well, Jesus was in the tomb for, according to the Gospels, 3 days, but it was only part of those days. And they'll say, well, rigor mortis, he couldn't have been in a state of rigor mortis at the time these images were formed. Well, enter Teddi, and Teddi, remember to be as concise but as detailed as you can, just for Jordan's sake.
Together.
But yeah, Teddi is an expert on this, so like, perfect, this is for her kind of thing. But
yeah, the great thing is that there are even some people in the shroud world that are not so sure that rigor. I mean, when you calculate how long Jesus was dead, we know that he died at 3:00 on Friday, and he wasn't dead for 3 days in terms of 3 24-hour periods. The Jews, even part of a day still would count as a day. So when it says in the Gospels that he rose, and when Jesus predicted that he would rise on the third day, again, it doesn't mean it has to be 24 hours times 3. No. The third day, what counted as the third day was, according to the Gospels, you see that when the Marys came and discovered the empty tomb, it had just become dawn, which counts as the third day. So there's a very tight window. I was Googling to see online, like about what time during that time of year would you have sunrise in Jerusalem. So, I mean, it's pretty tight that it's right around the 39-hour mark. Well, there's this thing called the March of Rigor that, medical students frequently learn. You'll look online and read about rigor mortis, and some people say, oh, it's gone by about 36 hours. Gone. Well, rigor mortis goes in stages. It comes in a stage, a progressive stage, and it leaves progressively. If it's gone, then one might say, well, how can you possibly be seeing rigor mortis? Or if there is rigor mortis, then it couldn't have, something's, off. Well, there are many factors that can affect how short or how long rigor mortis can last. But it can definitely last well beyond the 39-hour mark. I've got a paper that's going to be coming out this summer in the British Society of the Turin Shroud newsletter. So I don't want to give everything away. but I'll, once it comes out, I'll, we can talk more, but it can go on over 120 hours in certain situations. And it can definitely, even in more regular situations, last 48 and then start to be on the decline. So we are totally covered. There are so many competing factors as to whether Jesus's situation at death would have caused hastened or delayed rigor mortis, that the truthful answer is we really can't know for sure. What we can know for sure is the proof's in the pudding. We have a cloth with an image that nobody can replicate to this day, even though there's a $1 million challenge by David Rolfe, the filmmaker who's produced some Shroud films, and he used to be the editor of
Teddy,
the.
I just want to interrupt just for the sake of the audience, because what you said might be, just to clarify, you're saying we know for certain that the Shroud Man still being in rigor mortis at the 39-hour mark when the Gospels say Jesus rose from the dead, that is consistent with, or is potentially consistent with what we know of science and how rigor mortis, there's not a contradiction there, and that's
Exactly. If people see, because I see even in some current literature, I spent quite a bit of time on rigor mortis, and I found even papers that were pretty current, or reasonably current, where people were still repeating bad knowledge, because people, it's not just in the shroud world, it's in the medical world, it's in the scientific world, where people frequently just repeat what other people before them were saying, and they don't you can't always reinvent the wheel. So I understand that. But sometimes when something becomes a hot topic, you need to double check to be sure if that's correct. But so a lot of people keep repeating what used to be commonly taught in medical schools, the march of rigor, that it's a 36-hour period, that it takes 12 hours for rigor to develop, 12 hours for it to maintain itself, and 12 hours to go away, which puts it at the end 36 hours where there would be no rigor mortis. And so a lot of people who haven't delved into the topic think, oh no, there can't be rigor mortis. And so sometimes I think they end up not seeing what they really should be seeing as evidence of rigor mortis on the shroud. The positioning, especially the legs, the way they're bent, the position of the body is the position of someone who died in the crucified position while hanging off of a cross. Now, people will say, but wait a minute, the arms are not outstretched. Well, no, they weren't, because in order to fit now, in Jerusalem at first, there was a time period where they had the tombs, where they would use in the stone tombs, the fancy stone tombs, like what Joseph of Arimathea had. It would be like a little bench. But during Jesus's time, they started shifting over not just a bench, but like a niche. So it'd be like a carving within the wall, and then there's like a ledge where you put the body. Well, now, I would imagine this ledge is not terribly wide, but then you've got a wall, the rest of the walk on the other side, and with the other side open. Well, if the arms are outstretched like this, how are you going to get the body into that little bench where the arm's not hitting the wall? Well, you got to reposition it. Plus, I think it was also just a respectful, usually when we bury people now in a coffin, their hands are crossed. So, and some people say, well, why didn't they bend the legs? Well, there was no need to bend the legs or to straighten out the legs to break the rigor mortis in the legs, because you could still position the body onto the little ledge in the niche. So yeah, the fact that the positioning of the man, that there's no putrefaction and decomposition on the shroud, it just the Isabel Pixek, the artist, she also talked about, if you look as an artist, the perspective that an artist would have, because you'd have to have a live model. But even if you had a live model, even if you had the best artist in the world, how are they going to get the front and the back image to where, if you superimpose them, they line up, they coordinate, like a positive and negative fitting into each other. We see, for example, on the frontal image, there's no neck that shows, which is consistent with a body hanging. When a body is hanging like this, the head's going to be like this. Now, if the head's looking up, do you see my neck? No, because the neck kind of gets trapped in between the shoulders, and that's what we see on the body image. But then they broke the rigor mortis in the shoulders, but this is still up like that. And so, but now what do you see on the dorsal image, the back image? You don't see neck on the front image. On the back image, you see more neck than you should see, because again, the neck is down. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like bookends that just fit perfectly. How is an artist going to get something like that to fit just like that? That ain't happening. I guess if you had a statue, but then with a statue, you end up, if you covered a statue in ink and put the shroud on top, you're going to have distortions from the cloth. You're not going to get the image.
I think that's where
we see.
I think like an important point, because you just raised that, is something that we haven't even mentioned in this entire show that I think is really important for the audience, because assuming they're new to the shroud, Teddi hinted that there are other features, right? So when STURP studied the shroud, we've talked about the fact that there was no paint on the shroud, or paint isn't sufficiently on there to explain the images. Secondly, the body is in a state of rigor mortis and is anatomically accurate. The blood stains, there's no body images under the blood stains. But Teddi hinted at two other, what I call of these minimal relevant features, these physical or chemical properties. So another one, implying resurrection, is that we know the body had to leave before sufficient decomposition set in. There's no evidence of decomposition liquids, and especially if it's in someplace like Jerusalem and stuff, there would be a buildup of these liquids, especially in the bodily orifices, very quickly. So it looks like this is confirming the Gospels. Jesus resurrected, or this shroud man left the cloth within 39 hours, at 39 hours or less or something, before these liquids could accumulate. And
right
on that front, in terms of the body images, there are other features that are remarkable, right? So why do we think they're miraculous? Well, it's number one, we mentioned negativity, but there's also, this is what prompted STURP in 1976. Using a VP8 image analyzer, they proved that the images are three-dimensional, or to be more technically precise, they contain topographic or depth information on the frontal and dorsal images. And also, Teddi alluded to this, that we have proven mathematically that the images, whatever encoded those images, were vertically mapped. They were vertically aligned. So they traveled in a straight, vertical, rectilinear direction, like throwing a fastball, or perhaps a curvilinear process, like with electrostatic means, kind of like a curveball. It bows out, but then it comes straight back. So the images were, whatever process created them, were vertically aligned. Otherwise, we would have these horizontal, lateral distortions. It's sometimes known as the Mask of Agamemnon effect, where if you wrap a cloth around your face, put paint on your face and the sides of your head, and then you wrap a cloth around it, when you flatten that cloth out, it's going to be a widened, stretched out picture of a face. Does that make sense? Sure, I can show a picture of it if I need to, but
Yeah, if you have a picture, you can go ahead and show that. We can pull it up on screen.
so here's what's called the Mask of Agamemnon. It's been flattened out and stretched out. Now this would be the same on the shroud cloth. If you wrapped the shroud cloth around a head and then you flattened out the cloth and the imprint was there, it would be stretched out wider with these horizontal distortions. It wouldn't look like a real face like what we have with the Shroud of Turin. So that's why we know it was whatever process encoded the shroud had to be vertically aligned, and that rules out all artistic mechanisms and every naturalistic mechanism. That feature alone. And then a final thing. Teddy also mentioned there's no directionality of the images. So if you had a paintbrush, did you paint side to side, up and down, diagonally? There's no directionality. And then two other features, that whatever encoded the images did not encode images beyond 4 centimeters. So like it traveled 4 centimeters and then it stopped encoding. It's not like light where it would just keep going forever. Like it would, light travels well beyond 4 centimeters, right? So whatever image encoded there, it stopped after 4 centimeters. And that relates to the fact that there's body image superficiality. The color, that yellow color, is only on the very surface, the top 2 to 3 fibrils of each thread. And bear in mind, a fibril has the thickness of a human hair. I think it's even less than that, technically. So, and on each fibril, the color is only on the 0.2 micrometer surface of each fibril. Again, the size of a human hair, diameter of a human hair, and it's only on that primary cell wall. That rules out. I mean, paint would soak way down beyond the superficial layers.
And each thread has about 100 microfibers or microfibrils. So
Yep,
with one thin piece of thread, it's just hitting the top 1 to 2 microfibers, which you can't do that because if you put a normal liquid like watercolor onto the linen, that's going through capillary flow, going to seep all into the fiber and then to the sides, and that's not what you see in the body image. There's also in the body image, if it were with watercolor paint, as Macron said it was, you would see like where you have the crossing of the threads, right? You got one threads going this way and then that way. Where they intersect, you would see if there was paint, even watercolor paint, you would see cementation with the paint. You would see meniscus marks. Like when you look at
the threads would be cemented together, is what she's.
Or if nothing else, you would see markings with the color. A meniscus, like let's say if you have a glass of water, okay? The water is going to hike up a little bit higher up against the glass than it is in the rest of the area of the glass. It crawls up a little bit on the sides. Those are the meniscus marks.
The edges are upraised.
And you would see if there were paint on it, you would see those little meniscus marks in the cross sections, the interstices of the fabric. Yet that is not seen. Sorry.
Yeah,
Dale.
no, that's great. Yeah, so my point here, and then I'll give it back to Jordan because he's got a question on rigor mortis for you there. But my point here is that this is why we're saying, why do we say these images are miraculous? It's because we have proven scientifically through STURP these various physical and chemical features which are unique to the shroud images only. No other image in the history of art has these features. No other known image, natural or artistic, has these features. And it's on this basis we can use these features to evaluate all of the potential artistic and natural explanations to try to explain these images, they all fail. It's only the supernatural hypotheses that can explain all of these features. So that's one thing that I think is important for the audience, especially if you're new to the shroud. That's important for you to know. But yeah, back to you, Jordan, for your
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something that I think we kind of forgot to mention. Probably would have been good to kind of point out in the beginning, just those features of the image, and that there's like depth information encoded into the image, and the fact that it is on those uppermost fibers. There's just all these different elements at play that make it, again, going back to you saying earlier, Teddy, just how it's unreasonable. A lot of the alternative, or maybe all of the alternative theories about how that image came to be through some sort of, human process, they just fall apart. But yes, my question about rigor mortis is probably a very simply answered one. But as you're talking about that, I'm just thinking a little bit about the timeline of when, Jesus's body would have been taken off the cross and they would have been wrapping it. Is that, is there enough time that would have taken place between Jesus's death and then them taking him off the cross and putting him into the cloth? Would have rigor mortis set in by then? I mean, what's the time frame that it would have set in where you would have seen those locked knees and you would have needed to, move his hand and break the rigor mortis to put his hands in the position they're in? Would enough time have passed by the time they're actually wrapping the body for that to have set in?
Typically, rigor mortis would probably kick in around the 3-hour mark. But again, you have rigor mortis is a very complicated situation, and different factors can affect it. So sometimes it can come on almost instantaneously. For example, if two people are fighting, like in war, and somebody dies in the middle of battle, that body can go into almost instantaneous rigor mortis. There's also a thing called a cadaveric spasm. Now, people used to talk about this, and then people used to say, oh no, the more recent information from Skeptic, it's a myth. When I was researching it, I was finding a big paper by somebody fancy saying cadaveric spasms are a myth. Well, again, you're always going to find these sorts of things. The thing is, you got to dig deeper. And in some of the scenarios that people were claiming were cadaveric spasms, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Like, for example, drowning victims where they're clutching some grass, like at the bottom of a river or something like that. And people are saying, well, no, that could have happened a different way. That's not necessarily a cadaveric spasm. But the problem is that there are, I ended up finding some case studies with situations where there's no doubt it was a cadaveric spasm. Like a guy was going after trying to stab his wife. He has the knife in his hand. She gets out a gun and shoots him, and he's now in rigor mortis with the knife, clutching the knife in this position. And so that is, definitely a cadaveric spasm. So there's a good likelihood that Christ might have experienced a cadaveric spasm, which would be instantaneous stiffness. But he also probably went into rigor mortis. The conditions were such that he probably went into rigor mortis, if not immediately, extremely quickly. There's plenty of situations where, yes.
Can I just ask very quickly? Does cadaveric spasm, say Jesus went into that instantaneously, would that last into the 3? So you'd be in the same position into the fact, and then rigor mortis takes over. So
yes,
okay,
yes.
Okay.
It does. It won't. The cadaveric spasms effects won't go until the rigor mortis and all of it leaves the body. So it'll stay in that position. And the interesting thing too, back with the artist Isabel Pixek, with the position of rigor mortis, again, imagine Jesus hanging vertically on the shroud. The feet, the soles of the feet are flush up against the cross. By having so as the feet are flush against the cross, that's going to cause the knees to bend out. Think of like if you see the side image of a crucifix, the knees are bent outward because they're forced to be bent out because the soles are flush against the stipes, the vertical column on the cross. So that's bent, and the position, like with the arms, even once the rigor mortis was broken from the arms, you still have these bizarre positions. So Isabel Pixek hired I guess she paid him, or I don't know, maybe he volunteered, but an artist model to get into the position that we see the body on the shroud. And you can see, when you look at those knees, you can see they're bent. And one of the things, there's great anatomical accuracy to the shroud. Some people say, oh, the arms are too long. No, the arms aren't too long. Some people say the legs are too long on one side. No, the legs aren't too long. The arms just look longer because the knees are bent, which makes the legs look shorter. And so the legs will look longer from the front and it'll look shorter from the dorsal image. It's all, again, it all fits just perfect. It's so perfect. You just, no clever forger could have pulled that off. And Isabel Pixek said that when you look at the perspective of the body image, she said that for an artist to use a model, as she did, in order to, as the artist, to have the model to look at in order to paint it, she said you'd have to get on a ladder probably about 15 feet high, looking down at the model to get that perspective so that you have a model from which to draw. So how are you going to do it? There are no outlines on the shroud. How are you going to get the blood stains? Back to the blood stains. Since there are no outlines on the shroud, and we know that the blood came first, image second, which only makes perfect sense because as soon as you put a bloody body in a cloth, well, the blood's going to come first. And of course, it makes sense that the image came second from the energy from the resurrection. But so she was talking about how just, it would just be so impossible to get a model to be in that position with the knees bent, with the buttocks not flattened, not laying flat up against the ledge or anything. It would be such a contorted position that there's no way that the model would be able to hold that position. And then she said, how are you going to then do the dorsal, the back image? What's the model going to get into that knee bent position and balance on the tip of his nose face down so the artist can see the back? I mean, it's absurd. And without there being an outline to an image, how did the artist know precisely where to put the blood? Because we don't just have blood clots. Sebastian Rodante, a physician, he had written a paper about the blood stains and goes into great detail. And he was talking about how you can see certain blood in certain areas where it's arterial blood coming from an artery. certain other blood, the blood flows differently when it's coming out of the vein. And all of that is forensically accurate in terms of how the blood is flowing. So we have that detail too, showing that it's coming from a human body from where it's supposed to be coming, flowing out in the manner that it's expected to flow. And with the side wound from the lance wound, we know that this is a post-mortem blood flow. If a heart, and Dr. Zugaby and Dr. Buckland talk about how with blood spatter evidence, if you spear somebody and stab them right where they were stabbed in the ribs, if the heart is still beating, the blood's going to spray out because of a pumping heart. But when you look at the blood stain, it's like the blood just bloop, just sort of drips out. And that's because there was no beating heart. The life was out of them. So it's just, I like to say to skeptics, they're going to end up being forced to believe in a miracle one way or the other.
Right.
Miracle of the body image being created in a miraculous way from the resurrection. And the other important thing is,
I just want to quote Barry Schwartz has a great quote on that front, right? So he's like, look, so Barry Schwartz, just so you know, he does not believe in miracles currently. He's not a Christian. He's Jewish, but he was the official STURP photographer, and he came to believe in God, and he believes the shroud is authentic in terms of covering the historical Jesus. But he has this great saying, kind of what like Teddi was saying. He's like, look, if you're going to tell me some medieval artist created the shroud images, given what we know about it scientifically, then I believe in miracles, because there's no way an artist would
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, that's a great way of just emphasizing that you have to you're drawn to a miraculous conclusion one way or the other with all the evidence stacked up. You have to do something with the data that's available, and to conclude, you can do that. And I think some do, obviously, that this was somehow created, a forgery of some kind. That, as I've heard many shroud experts state, like, if that's the case, I want to meet that person, because who were they, and how did they have the ability to do what they did in creating this image?
Exactly. Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is an extremely powerful argument, and that is that Christ, before he died, numerous times, as it's chronicled in the Gospels, in not just one book, but numerous, he made falsifiable claims. He said that he was going to be killed, and he said that he was going to rise on the third day. Now, okay, so he made this claim. How's God going to prove it? Well, hello, there's your shroud. I mean, what else do you want? I mean, come on. In the words of Joe Biden, come on, man. It's like, what else can you ask for? God has given you a cloth with his image as God incarnate, with his blood still on it in clotted form. We've got the Gregory Referendarius talking about in 944, before the medieval time period, clots of blood.
And what I'm hoping people who are listening in, especially if you're new to the shroud, what you're taking away, at least one thing you're taking away from this conversation, is just understanding the depth of research and science that it goes into studies of the shroud. That this is much more than some strange, obscure conspiracy, simply just, propagated by the Catholic Church, or just these kind of quickly dismissive thoughts that I think so many people have when they encounter the Shroud. I hope what you're saying is that there's just a lot more substance to Shroud research than what perhaps you might have thought before. And I'm saying that because that's what I discovered when I actually became willing to kind of give it a fair hearing. But I guess the last question I'd like to get both of your thoughts on quickly to kind of wrap this up would just be about more of the practical meaning of all this. And Teddi, you were just touching on this a few minutes ago about the what this would mean in terms of if this is actually the authentic burial shroud of Christ, which is something that both Christian people and non-Christian unbelievers have become convinced of, which I think is not a something to quickly dismiss. The fact that people, like Barry Schwartz, who was the photographer on the STURP team, who was not a Christian, went into this with a lot of hesitation, from what I understand of his story, because he didn't want to get it mixed up in some kind of religious motivated project, and came to after years of thinking about this and digging into it himself, came to determine that he thinks, as a non-Christian, that this is the authentic burial cloth of Christ, and others have come to that assessment as well, of course. But if that is true, what does that mean? I mean, it means a lot of things for me, but I'd like to know, like, what, and maybe we can start with you, Dale. What does this mean for you? Because this is something that, you spend a lot of time talking about. You have a lot of investment in this. You spend a lot of time on your channel talking about this. Why even talk about this? Why is this important to you? What does this mean, do you think, for this generation, really, if it can be determined that this thing really is the cloth that Christ's body was wrapped in?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the practical importance of studying the Shroud and the Shroud of Turin, I'm going to resort to my friend Gary Habermas. I had him on my show to debate Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry, and he appealed to there's 3 levels of significance, right? So, number one, the most basic thing is that it has secular historical value. Even if it's not Jesus's, or it's not a miraculous image or anything like that, this is a cloth that seems to be depicting historical crucifixion. So you can gain historical knowledge as to how crucifixions and scourgings worked in the first century, or the ancient world, since we can date the Shroud to that time. The second level, if we can link it to the historical Jesus, well, then that has great sentimental, historical, theological value, because we're linking this cloth to our Lord and Savior, and it's kind of just like seeing, having contact with a historical archaeological building or something. It connects you to the past. There's something tangible and physical where we can, this covered our Lord and Savior. This is the shroud he was buried in when he died for my sins and rose from the dead. So there's great value there. But for me, by far, the most important in terms of value is about the question of image formation and the science. Can we prove that these images were formed through a miraculous process? And that, for me, is the real kicker, because if we can prove that, I've had skeptics say, "Oh, okay, let's say it did cover Jesus. Who cares? What value is that to me? I mean, people had burial shrouds. Who cares?" Well, if we can prove those images are miraculous, that's where you have to care, because that's saying Christianity is true. It's not just that the historical Jesus was real. It's that the Jesus Christ of the Gospels is real, and that Jesus was historical, and that gives us hope for eternal salvation. We can then place our faith in Christianity and Jesus for our salvation. So that by far is the most important thing, right? If we believe Christianity is true through this miraculous image, then we can repent, place our faith in Christ, the one who made those images miraculously for us, and come to a saving knowledge of God. So that's three levels of value for me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of, at what point, like the person who might say, okay, well, maybe I'll grant that this is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, but still, what does that matter? That means nothing to me. It does seem to get to this point where it comes down to, I think, the overall evidence that we have for Christianity, where I think, and just creation and the existence of God in general, where I think to those, I would maybe word it in the way of whose hearts are positioned, I guess, to maybe use more of the words like Jesus uses, where he says something to the extent of, to those who will to do my will, they will know of the teaching, whether it's from God or not. And I think in a similar fashion, that seems to be how God has kind of set up our capacity to believe and put our faith in him and the message of the gospel, that there's sufficient evidence. There's plenty of evidence to believe, but there's enough room to choose to not believe if you don't want to. And so it seems like what I find even with the shroud is it seems it comes down almost to like a heart level. And so I don't want to go too far down that road, but to a degree, I can see how it almost seems similar to the gospel, in that it comes down to almost like this heart level of if it seems like if one's heart is willing to do Christ's will, is in that position of humility and openness to what God is doing, what he has done, then won't they be able to recognize that this is something God has done? Of course he did this. Of course he would have given us almost a literal photograph that tells the entire story of the gospel. Of course he would. And of course, in this age of science and skepticism, it would be now that we have the technology to uncover that, something that for centuries this cloth existed. And yes, it had great significance, but now in this age of skepticism and science, how much more significance does it have for us? It's like as if it was waiting for photography to be invented to say, hey, you guys, you're going to, I've heard it in my own life. I've heard people say, why didn't he just give us like a picture of the resurrection happening, or just a quick video image? Then I would believe, and I find myself having these sort of doubts and these questions. And so were you going to say something there, Teddy?
They won't believe that either. There are certain people that just refuse to believe, and that's part of free will. You can have the most astounding evidence, which we are given with the shroud, proof of the supernatural realm, yet even when they do know it, and Dale and I know skeptics that know the evidence as well as we do, and they still deny it, and that's part of free will. Some people some people aren't agnostics. They're not atheists. They're anti-theists. And there is no proof that's going to be good enough, because they do not want to believe, or really, they don't want, they're constantly wanting to just stick it to God and to defame him, to say that he's a moral monster, things like that. And so they're going to just deny, kind of like the little, like the person is like, no, I don't hear you. There's no, a picture of the resurrection ain't going to do it either. Because actually, that's what we have with the shroud. We do have a picture of the resurrection with a supernatural camera, as Julia
right.
would say, divine photography, right there.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's what we have, this thing that a lot of people would want. But I think that to affirm that the shroud is authentic and that the image on it is miraculous, that comes with a lot of baggage, if you will. And baggage is a pejorative term, and I don't mean it that way, but it comes with a lot, because to affirm that this is the authentic burial shroud of Christ, and it does seem to confirm that his body was somehow no longer in that shroud, 39 hours later or before, you have to do something that brings a person to self-reflection that I think, many of it's difficult to do. And that says something about how people are living their life. It gets very practical. What does this mean about what the choices I'm making and how I'm living and how I'm operating in this world? The Shroud has something really to say about all of that, if it's true. And so that does make it something that it goes beyond just being able to look at the evidence. I think it makes it difficult to look at the evidence objectively without bias, because it does come with all of that. It comes ultimately with Christianity seems to be true. And what am I going to do with that? And so, but that, I guess that's a little bit of my take, but what would you say is the significance of the Shroud? For you, Teddi?
I think, and you hit on something, and I've mentioned it separately myself, and so I was glad that you hit upon that and saw that as a factor as well. I think a lot of people don't want the Shroud to be legitimate, but to me, the most important thing about it is that, we talk about Christianity being an evidence-based religion, and Jesus is held to that. He has given us the evidence, again, the falsifiable claim ahead of time. He's given us the evidence afterwards. There was this supernatural darkness that is witnessed by non-Christians, historians, secular historians during that time, that cannot explain, why there would be darkness in the land. It wasn't an eclipse, because you can't have one during that time of year. And so God has done so many things to tell us, hello, wake up. This is real. I'm real. Get your life in order. Do what you need to do. I'm not making you trust in me just on faith. I'm giving you compelling evidence that if you have eyes that see and ears that can hear, and do not want to run from me, but you want to come to me, I will give you all that you need. And on top of that, I will let you see what I look like. I will preserve in this world, at this day and time, we still have a piece of Jesus from his body that is with it. That blows my mind. I have not had the privilege of seeing the Shroud, but I just can't even imagine how I'll be standing in the presence of Jesus's blood. I know that I will be absolutely overwhelmed. But in times of crisis, again, that's when doubts can sometimes, if somebody gets a horrible diagnosis of cancer or something like that, and they're scared. And especially if it looks like it's terminal. And they start to wonder, is God real? Is heaven real? I've been basing it just on faith, but, is it really real? And all you have to do is learn the Shroud evidence, read some books, read the science, learn the chemistry. And then all you have to do is tell yourself, what's the likelihood that all of this information is wrong? It's next to impossible. I mean, I firmly believe anything's possible. So, okay, there's a little bit of but it's irrational to not think, because based on the science. God gives us that science. He gave it to us. I find some people, especially more perhaps like Protestant leaning people, they just want to shut down the Shroud. And you'll frequently hear them say, I don't need the Shroud. I have faith in God. My faith is secure. And, if I'm going to be really candid, and I'm going to be, I pick up a lot of pride when I hear that statement. Like, look at me. I'm just so special. I don't need proof. I'm not like doubting Thomas. I believe. But you know what? God was okay with Thomas putting his hands in the wound. And
Yeah.
God has given us this gift. And so to me, those people are just saying, I don't need to pay attention to that. It's like is that okay to just, downplay or deny a miracle? I don't think so. It's like, okay, before people know the evidence, it's one thing to be agnostic, but some people, like I said, just have this holier than that. I don't need that, and blah, 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 blah. And like, oh, well, I guess, some people need that evidence, but I don't need that. That to me is very prideful. That's a lot of hubris. And it always strikes me the wrong way when I hear that. And I'm like, you know what? This is a gift from God, and you're being an ingrate when you are not at least exploring.
Is that what you Orthodox call prelist, right?
The what?
I've heard the word prelist, the sin of prelist or something, meaning arrogant pride or something like that. I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, I've encountered that reaction here and there too, a bit, and it almost seems that bringing up the shroud, it causes like discomfort. It causes some sort of discomfort in a lot of Protestants. I don't exactly know why, but it makes them uncomfortable. It's something strange. It's new. It's almost like it's too good to be true, almost, where it causes them to want to like just kind of push it out of the way, just get it out of mind and out of sight and out of thought, because it causes like almost like they don't want to have to think about it. They don't want to have to come to a decision about it. It's too new, it's too odd, it's too strange. And so I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I understand the psychology behind that, but
they jump to
say that again.
They jump to the notion of idolatry. This is an image and you can't worship an image.
Yes.
You know what?
Yes, right.
You're not worshiping the image. You can worship the blood that's on the image, but even forget worship. It's about appreciating what this gift is and what it tells us that the supernatural realm is real. Because right now, the scientific evidence is that this cloth cannot be made by human hands. People say, oh, well, science doesn't prove things, it discounts it. No. I'm a lawyer. I'm not bound by the little rules of scientists. I don't have to play by those games. I use evidence. I'm ruled and governed by evidence. And I look to see, okay, here's an argument. I'm going to look for the evidence, see if it holds up. And I use pieces of science, like lawyers do, pieces of science, you put it together and you go where the evidence leads. That's what every scientist says. So it's not that science, because people, we always hear, and lots of our own people say, well, science can't prove that God exists. And I'm like, yes, it can prove God exists. It does here. STURP science proves beyond a reasonable doubt God exists. You're piecing the information together. You are doing what lawyers call creating a circumstantial case. People think that indirect evidence, circumstantial evidence, isn't solid evidence. Baloney. Eyewitness testimony can be some of the most unreliable testimony. In a trial, a circumstantial case can be very powerful. Why? Because you're getting evidence that's coming from all sorts of directions, independent pieces of evidence that all, as we say, it weaves a web that is so tight. If it's enough to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, it weaves a web that is so tight where there's only one answer to what that points to. Now, if it points to several different things, well, That's not so great in terms of at least a trial or beyond a reasonable doubt. But with the shroud, we've got evidence coming from so many different directions, and it all points to the same thing, that Jesus was who he said he was. He told us in advance what was going to happen. The shroud proves it. You know, you got the dark. It's just, I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches. And for people to just, the shroud, I'm not interested. That's a Catholic. No, it's not a Catholic thing. It's a thing for all of us that has been bestowed upon all of us from God. And so to ignore it, I don't think it's okay to ignore a miracle. I mean, and it's meant to provide awe. And what could be more awe-inspiring than Christ's face miraculously produced on a shroud that evidences the details from the Gospels, that has his blood on? I mean, it's like, what more do people want? If people deny it, that's on them. And let them, if they manage to get up in heaven, let them answer to God as to why they, didn't appreciate such a beautiful gift, and maybe even why they sow doubt in other people about, because like I said, the shroud gives us confidence beyond a reasonable doubt that God of Christianity is real. So it's very special.
Yeah, and so I hope that's an invitation to people, because I sense the similar frustration that I've experienced a little bit of, and just I think it's a little bit difficult, and I can kind of sympathize for people who I kind of put this stuff on, because when I first started diving into this a year ago, it became, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, like Dale, I literally listened to hours. I'm in a big remodeling project on my home, and so I would spend day after day, just entire days working. And as I'm working, I'm listening to Real Seekers and any shroud material I can get my hands on. And I'm just like in awe. I'm like, how are people not talking about this? And then you try to bring that excitement into people who really haven't given 2 seconds thought of the shroud. And they're just, and you see that immediate dismissal of it, like, I'm not, that's just, or whatever that dismissal is. And there can be a frustration, like, what do you not, you don't realize what this thing is and how significant this is. That this is earth shattering. If this is true, this is no small thing. This is what is more significant than a photograph of the resurrection, of both the crucifixion, the death, and the resurrection. They're all, that information is contained in this image, and it's kind of unbelievable, really. But I think I found the shroud in a time of, I went through the past several years of just some pretty intense doubt, and just kind of putting my Christian faith really on the table and saying, I don't know what parts of this are true. I don't know if any of it is true. But coming to the point, without the shroud's help, but prior to that, of coming to realize I am convinced, based on the evidence, that Christianity is true, and this is where I can place my faith. And so it was shortly, in that process, when I'd kind of become more settled once again in my faith, that I came upon the shroud. And so I don't think the shroud is necessary for Christian faith, but when I did encounter it, it was just this, I don't think it's overly dramatic for me to say, in many ways it was a life-changing thing to encounter, where it was like, oh, this is just, I did feel that Thomas kind of experience, just this gentle, subtle way of God giving to all of us, I think, just saying, I know for so many of you need to put your hands in my side and to touch the holes in my hand. And I'm not rebuking you for that. I'm not saying you have.
God just gave it to us.
Yes, right. And it's there. It's there for us to look at, and almost in a sense, really be able to do what Thomas did, and no longer be unbelieving, but be believing. And so I think it is a powerful thing. I think it is a powerful piece of evidence that just further supports the truthfulness of Christianity. Again, I don't think, as I think Gary Habermas and others say, you don't need the shroud you can have confidence, I think, in the truthfulness of Christianity apart from it. But man, does it add just this whole other layer, this whole other dimension of confidence and evidence to the Christian faith.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear everything you're saying. So in the first place, like I told you when you first told me about the impact of my show, that means a heck of a lot to me. That's why I do what I do. I'm so honored that I played a role in like helping you see the truth of this amazing evidence that God has given us for a miracle. That's really important to me. That's why I love seeing my measure of success. It isn't how many subscribers I've got or likes or views. I always track on my blog how many people are clicking on those sources that I give, because I give those peer papers and I track those numbers. I'm like, okay, that's a good day. I've got 100 people clicking on this peer review paper or whatever it is. So that's for me, my measure of success. Like people are responding to it. But I hear what you're saying, like, especially in academia, man, it's so disappointing as an academic. I remember I wanted to bring the shroud as a possible PhD dissertation and stuff like that. And, my advisor, no one's open to that. Like, there's not a chance. Even things like just, okay, well, what about how do we identify miracles? Because I think I've got a unique thing in that in terms of applying specified complexity to miracles. And obviously I apply that theory to the Shroud of Turin or the historical evidence for the resurrection. But there's just this, I don't know, this revulsion to anything like that. And yeah, there's this automatic assumption in academia and as an academic, I'm a philosopher. So you would think there would be this hunger, this appetite, like, oh, that's new. Let's see the evidence. Let's get into it. Does it suck or is it great? And stuff. But there's no appetite.
It comes with the baggage.
Yeah. There is that baggage, and it's disappointing for me in the academic arena, let alone on a popular level. But I am thrilled that at least on a lay level, I think the tide is turning. When you know the history of the shroud, there seems to be throughout the 20th century, there is these on again, off again periods. I'm starting to sense that in terms of the lay level, we're starting to enter the on again period. There's this an increasing interest in the evidence. Maybe I'm crazy, but I'm getting that sense. I mean, I'm on Great Lakes Studios.
No, I agree.
Oh, sorry. I was about to compliment you, but you
sorry. Go ahead.
A knucklehead speaking about the shroud on the amazing Great Light Studios. That's right there.
Yes. Well, I was going to say I think you're right that there is probably a shift in that, and I think YouTube and platforms like YouTube are probably responsible for that, just because of the easy accessibility of information now, and that has just dramatically changed in the last decade or so. That people can just have conversations like this, and now who knows how many people are now able to sit and listen in and be introduced to the shroud in ways that they would have never been able to before. Like, how many people are gonna see a magazine about the shroud at the grocery store on a tabloid or something and say, hey, that's something I think I'm gonna go home or go to my local library and do a deep dive on. I mean, it's just so much more accessible now for people to be introduced to the evidence that there really is. And I think that is probably a contributing factor to, I think there is probably, in a sense, a shifting of the mindset about it, where I hope it will more and more become less of this thing that is just quickly and immediately dismissed as just this strange, obscure, quote unquote Catholic relic that people just have no interest in investigating, because I think there's no substance to it. I think that slowly that is going to change, and this will be something that is just seen for what it is, something that you have to, in a sense, come to a decision about. Like, this, here it is. Scholars mostly agree that this is likely authentic. What do you do with that?
And more than that, maybe even spur future testing. Come on, let's put the pressure on this Pope. change his mind. Maybe.
Yes, right.
Awesome. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much. Like I said, I really am honored that you brought me and Teddy on to like speak about the Shroud and stuff like that.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes, well, I'm honored that you guys joined me, and thank you for sticking around the 4-hour mark. I'm pretty well known in a lot of my videos that once I get going, I have a hard time stopping, and so I'm not new to 4-hour videos, but I always feel a little bad when. Okay, yeah.
No,
I've listened to enough of your shows that I figured you guys would be fairly comfortable with a longer one. So
I have told Dale repeatedly, and I've told some other people repeatedly, these 1-hour shows, it's like just as I'm starting to get to the good stuff, it's like, oh, we've got to rack. But I'm like, you can't really do much, especially with the Shroud. There's so much there's so much more evidence that we haven't even gotten into. And the more you dig, the more fascinating it becomes. And but yeah, I've told Dale, it's like you can't even when like on Skeptics and Seekers when we were on there, and we would debate different topics. I noticed a trend that you really can't have a good discussion on a topic unless it's about 4 hours. At least a good, and usually. You can get a lot done in 4 hours, but the ones that are shorter than that, it just kind of scratching the surface, and they're sort of shallow. And one thing I want to encourage people about. So I'm not a scientist. I don't like science. In terms of like being science oriented. No, I'm not that. But I am interested in evidence for God's existence beyond a reasonable doubt. That fascinates me, and so. People, don't be shy or even lazy about get in and learn. If I can't tell you how many times to understand, I might look like I've got a good command of a lot of this. I had to read it over and over and over again for stuff to really start to sink in and gel. It doesn't just happen overnight. Read it. Read stuff. Read papers. Shroud.com is, it's the place to go. It's the biggest database for information about the Shroud. It's all free. It's like, read papers, especially the papers written by STURP, which it'll show the STURP papers up top. Read it. Yeah, you know what? It's not going to be fun reading it. It's going to be hard reading it. And when you read it a second and third time, it's going to be hard unless you're a science or unless you're just oriented towards that. But do you want to have the kind of unshakable confidence in God's existence? If you want that, then, put some effort into it. And you know what? The reward will just surpass your expectations. It's worth putting in the time. It didn't all have to be done in a day. And honestly, the easiest way to do it now with YouTube, listen to a bunch of debates. Dale and I, we've had lots of talks. Dale's had talks with other Shroud scholars. I mean, it's so easy now. You can, be multitasking. You can be in your car. You can be getting ready in the morning. You can be washing dishes, listening to things. Then listen to it again. Listen to it several times. Let the information sink in. But if you ever hit a time of crisis, and most people will, having confidence beyond a reasonable doubt, I'll tell you, there's no substitute for that.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. I found myself multiple times, even when anxiety about, am I going to suddenly discover I have cancer, or the what ifs, when you see these things happening in other people, it can sometimes cause some self-reflection there and make you re-recognize your own mortality. And I found my mind going back to the image of the face of the Shroud, and it's as if it's just this deep inward comfort of that would be okay. And Jesus, as he said, because I live, you also will live. And that's what one of the many things I guess I see being said, being like communicated in the image in the shroud, is it's saying something about death itself. And it's telling us that this, where, O death, is your sting. I when I look at the shroud, that's just, some of the things that I feel like it's saying in that image. It's speaking that reality, that death itself, the power has been overcome. And this man rose again. He resurrected. He somehow was no longer in that shroud where he was before. And so it just kind of has been that sort of comfort to me as well, where the fear of death can be kind of quieted down just from what is being communicated there in that image. So again, I just think it's something that is worth considering. It's worth any Christian, any believer doing more than giving that quick dismissal for whatever the motivation, the many different motivations might be behind immediately dismissing that. I think it's very much worth, because it is a gift. I think it's something it's blessed my life in many ways. And I think it'll bless other people who are just willing to give it a fair hearing and a fair consideration.
Yeah. I had a dear friend of mine. He was an elderly gentleman, and I had known him for probably at least 15 years. And one day we got into a discussion, and I found out he was an agnostic. Now, he grew up as a Christian, in a Christian household, but he, real sharp fellow and very critical thinker. And he was like doubting Thomas. He needed strong scientific evidence that God was real. He didn't have any animosity towards God or the thought of God. He was certainly not an anti-theist, but he needed strong evidence in order to get on board with the program. And as soon as I found out about it, I asked him, I said, have you ever heard about the Shroud of Turin? And he didn't. And of course, then, I get on a tear for about 2 weeks. I bombard him through emails with sending him some particular Shroud papers and highlighting certain information. And in about 2 weeks with these things, because like I said, he had a truly open mind. He ended up coming to Christ with the Shroud evidence. And there are many people, many atheists, agnostics, who have come to Christ. So it's important for the non-believers to help bring them to Christ. We have many Shroud scholars who used to be non-believers and who are now believers and Shroud scholars. But it's also a blessing in the lives of Christians, because we don't have to just have faith in God's existence. We can have knowledge of that. And all it requires is just the tiniest bit of faith on top of a mountain of knowledge. But I mean, when you start to really know the evidence, you see the absurdity of the Shroud being anything other than what it obviously is. So, even the people way back when could tell it was an image not made by human hands. So if they could tell, come on, as Biden would say, come on, man.
How much more should we be able to tell? Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for all your time. And I would just, again, point people, if you're wanting to dive deeper into this, Dale, on his channel, Real Seekers, which again, I'll link to in the video description below, has a lot of hours of content on this. So make sure to check out his channel if you want to dive deeper into this, which hopefully many of you will. And Teddi, is there anything that you would want to point people to? Any place, any work you're doing, or anything like that you want to mention before we close down?
I'm working on a book. and it's called The Blood of Christ. And I delve deeply into it's going to be in two parts, at least two parts, doing very deep dives, going through lots of old arguments and double checking everything, because I'm not really into losing arguments. So I try to do my very best to make sure that when I stick my neck out, it's not going to get chopped off.
Yeah.
So I'm evaluating a lot of traditional Shroud scholarship and just going with the arguments that I feel will just, give knockouts.
Yeah, cool. Well, Dale, any last things you want to say before we close down?
Yeah, I guess so. On my show, I'm at Real Seekers, as Jordan already mentioned. I have a playlist called Shroud Wars, which is where I bring on all the experts, pro and con, on the Shroud to debate various things. I think my next Shroud-related show will be a panel review on the Carbon-14 dating specifically, but I'm bringing on all the experts. So Bob Rucker, Joe Marino, Dr. Thomas McAvoy, Michael Kowalski, who is in the same book club as Teddy. He wrote a book in that series on the Carbon-14, as well as a nuclear engineer as the Shroud skeptic, Jordan from Reason to Doubt, who he's also a nuclear engineer like Bob. So they're going to be discussing and debating the Carbon-14 and the pros and cons of the various explanations for that. That'll be April 12th.
That sounds like it'll be a very fascinating, jam-packed conversation. So yeah, definitely be looking out for that. And hopefully we can get you guys back on sometime in the future, because this was a lot of fun for me and went pretty deep, and I think gave people a lot to think about. So
and there's way more.
Oh yes, way more. If you go over to the Real Seekers channel and just start looking around, you'll see that there's just so much to this topic, so much more to dive into. But yes, thank you all for being here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.